The autumn of 1883 brought Clara Whitmore to Teller Ridge with nothing but a broken wagon and a recipe that would destroy an empire. When she entered the all-male survival cooking competition, the wealthy ranchers laughed. The railroad elites mocked her, but when the most feared mountain guide in Colorado tasted her stew, terror replaced his arrogance, because the flavor dragged him back to a mother who vanished 20 years ago under mysterious circumstances. Clara wasn't there to win a contest. She was there to expose the men who poisoned her husband and buried the truth beneath decades of frontier corruption. This is the story of how a widowed cook brought powerful men to their knees, using nothing but patience, intelligence, and a pot of stew that tasted like justice. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The October wind cut through Teller Ridge like a dull blade, carrying the smell of wood smoke and animal fat across the makeshift competition grounds. Clara Whitmore stood beside her broken wagon, gripping the handle of an old iron pot so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Around her, 47 men prepared their cooking stations with the efficiency of people who'd never questioned whether they belonged. She was the only woman. She'd known that before she arrived. "Look at that," someone said behind her. The voice was loud enough to carry. "They'll let anybody enter now?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Clara didn't turn around. She'd heard worse. During the 3 weeks it took her to reach Teller Ridge, she'd heard every variation of the same joke. A woman entering the survival feast competition. A widow thinking she could cook alongside men who'd fed hunting parties in mining camps across the roughest territory in Colorado. The pot in her hands was heavy. Not just from the iron, though it weighed plenty. It was heavy because her late husband had carried it through 2 territories before fever took him last winter. Heavy because inside it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a recipe she'd memorized but never written down. Heavy because if she failed here, she had exactly $43 left and nowhere to go. "Ma'am." Clara looked up. A man in a wool coat stood 3 feet away, holding a wooden clipboard. His expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "You registered as Clara Whitmore?" "I did." "You understand the rules? Each competitor cooks a single dish using only what they brought and what they can forage within a half-mile of camp. Judges taste everything. Top 3 finishers split the prize purse and gain automatic entry to next year's Founders Banquet." "I understand." The man glanced past her at the broken wagon wheel. "You need help setting up your station?" "No." "All right then." He made a mark on his clipboard. "You've got until sundown, same as everyone else." He walked away before she could thank him. Clara turned back to her wagon and began unloading supplies. A cast iron skillet, a small sack of cornmeal, 3 onions, a bundle of dried herbs she'd gathered 2 days ago, a jar of rendered fat, and the pot. Always the pot. "Jesus Christ, she's serious." This voice came from her left. Clara didn't look. She arranged her supplies on the wooden plank someone had propped across 2 barrels. It wasn't much of a cooking station, but she'd worked with less. "Hey, lady." Now she looked. A man stood near the edge of her station. He was younger than most of the other competitors, maybe 30, with a thick beard and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You know what this competition is, right?" "I do." "It ain't a church social. These judges don't care if your biscuits are fluffy. They're looking for food that keeps a man alive when there's nothing else. Food that travels. Food you can make when you're 3 days from the nearest town and the snow's coming." "I know what survival cooking is." "Then why are you here?" Clara met his gaze without blinking. "Same reason you are." The man's smile faded. He turned and walked back to his own station without another word. Around her, the competition came to life. Men built fires, hauled water from the creek, sharpened knives. The air filled with smoke and the clang of metal on metal. Clara worked quietly, her movements deliberate. She built her fire small and controlled. While other competitors stacked logs high enough to roast entire deer, she arranged her coals in a tight circle that would hold heat without wasting wood. She wasn't here to impress anyone with flames. By noon, the first dishes began taking shape. Claire could smell venison, rabbit, wild turkey. One man was making some kind of stew with beans and salt pork. Another had cornbread baking in a Dutch oven. The smells were good, hearty, practical, exactly what the judges would expect. Clara ignored all of it. She worked with her back to the crowd, her hands moving through steps she'd practiced 100 times. First the onions, sliced thin and cooked low until they turned soft and sweet. Then the dried herbs, sage and thyme, carefully measured. She added the rendered fat, letting it melt and mix with the onions until the smell changed into something richer. The cornmeal came next. She toasted it lightly in her skillet, just enough to bring out the nutty flavor most people missed. Then into the pot it went, along with water from the creek and a pinch of salt she'd carried from 3 territories away. The mixture thickened slowly. Clara stirred and stirred. She didn't rush. Rushing ruined everything. What the hell is she making? The voice came from somewhere behind her. Clara didn't answer. She added more water, adjusting the consistency. The pot bubbled gently over the coals. She could feel people watching now, not just 1 or 2, more than that. The crowd had started to notice her because she wasn't doing what they expected. She wasn't cooking meat. In a survival competition where every man presented some variation of roasted game or preserved protein, Clara was making something that looked like porridge. "That's it?" someone said. "That's what she's serving." Laughter again. Louder this time. Clara kept stirring. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows stretched long over the competition grounds. One by one, the other competitors began plating their dishes. They used tin plates, wooden bowls, whatever they had. Each man carried his finished meal to the judges' table at the center of camp, a long plank stretched between sawhorses where 3 men sat waiting. Clara recognized one of them, Jonas Pritchard, the railroad supply contractor who'd made a fortune feeding mining camps across Colorado. The other 2 were strangers, but they had the same look, men with money who believed they understood hardship because they'd once spent a cold night in a hotel with a weak fire. The judging began. Each competitor approached the table. Each presented their dish. The judges tasted, made notes, said nothing. Some dishes earned nods. Others earned frowns. One man's venison was rejected entirely after the judges declared it oversalted. Clara waited. She was the last to finish. By the time her pot reached the right consistency, the sun was touching the horizon and most of the crowd had gathered near the judges' table to watch the final evaluations. She ladled her mixture into a wooden bowl. It didn't look like much, a thick golden porridge flecked with herbs. No meat, no garnish, just the simple result of ingredients cooked carefully and with purpose. She carried it toward the judges' table. The crowd parted as she walked, not out of respect, out of curiosity. They wanted to see what the woman had made. They wanted to watch her fail. Clara set the bowl on the table in front of Jonas Pritchard. He stared at it. "This is your entry?" "It is." "What is it?" "Survival porridge, cornmeal base, foraged herbs, rendered fat for calories. It'll keep a person alive for 3 days in cold weather with nothing else." Pritchard picked up his spoon. He didn't taste it. Instead, he looked at the other judges, and Clara saw something pass between them, a silent agreement. "Ma'am," Pritchard said slowly, "I appreciate your effort, but this competition is for serious entries. We're looking for food that represents genuine frontier survival skills. That's what I made. This is porridge. It's survival food. It's not what we're judging today." Clara's jaw tightened. "You said each competitor cooks a single dish using what they bring and what they forage. You said judges taste everything. You didn't say the food had to be meat." "We didn't think we needed to." The crowd murmured. A few men laughed. Pritchard set his spoon down. "I'm sorry, we can't accept this entry." "You mean you won't taste it?" "Ma'am, because it came from a woman." The murmuring stopped. Pritchard's expression hardened. "That has nothing to do with it." "Then taste it." "I don't need to taste it to know." "Taste it." The words came from somewhere behind the judge's table. The voice was deep, rough, and carried enough weight that the entire crowd went silent. Clara looked past Pritchard. A man stood at the edge of the firelight, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same mountains surrounding Teller Ridge. He wore a heavy coat and boots caked with mud. His eyes were the coldest thing Clara had ever seen. She knew who he was. Everyone in Colorado Territory knew who he was. Rowan Vale, the mountain guide. The man who'd led more expeditions through the Rockies than anyone alive. The man whose clients paid triple rate because when Rowan Vale took you into the mountains, you came back. Always. Pritchard turned in his chair. "Rowan, this isn't taste it. It's not necessary." "Taste it, Jonas." Something in Rowan's voice made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Pritchard's face flushed red. He picked up his spoon again, dipped it into Clara's porridge, and brought it to his mouth with the expression of a man forced to eat dirt. He swallowed. Clara watched his face carefully. Nothing changed. Pritchard set the spoon down. It's fine. Adequate. But it's not. Let me try it. Rowan crossed the distance to the judge's table in 4 long strides. He didn't ask permission. He took the bowl from in front of Pritchard, picked up a clean spoon from the table, and scooped a full mouthful of porridge. The moment he swallowed, everything changed. Rowan's entire body went still. The color drained from his face. His hand, the one holding the spoon, began to shake. Clara saw it. So did everyone else. Rowan? Pritchard stood up. What's wrong? Rowan didn't answer. He stared at the bowl like it had just spoken to him. His breathing had gone shallow and fast. Where did you learn this recipe? His voice came out hoarse. Clara's pulse quickened. My husband's family, they used it during a hard winter 20 years ago. What family? Whitmore. Out of Wyoming Territory before they moved south. Rowan's jaw clenched. Who taught them? A woman passing through their camp. They never learned her name. She stayed 3 days, taught them how to make food that would last, then disappeared before the snow came. Something cracked in Rowan's expression. Not anger, something worse. Something that looked like grief mixed with terror. He set the bowl down carefully, as though it might shatter. This recipe, he said quietly, belonged to my mother. The crowd erupted. Clara's breath caught. Rowan turned to face her fully, and Clara saw past the cold exterior to something raw and desperate underneath. She disappeared 23 years ago, winter of 1860. She was investigating supply chain corruption for a railroad investigation committee. They said she got lost in a storm. They said she froze. I don't understand, Clara managed. She was the best survival cook I ever knew, taught me everything before she vanished. This recipe, he gestured at the bowl. She made this exact dish. Same ingredients, same proportions. I'd know it anywhere. Pritchard had gone pale. Rowan, this doesn't mean bus. Shut up, Jonas. The railroad contractor's mouth snapped closed. Rowan looked at Clara again. Your husband. What happened to him? Clara's throat tightened. He died last winter. Fever took him after working a railroad supply route through Wyoming. He kept saying the meat tasted wrong, bitter. By the time we got him to a doctor, it was too late. Rowan's expression turned to stone. What route? Northern Pacific Extension. They were hauling preserved meat to mining camps. Which contractor? I don't know. The company never told us. Rowan turned to Pritchard. The look on his face made the railroad man take a step backward. Jonas, Rowan said softly, I think we need to have a conversation. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you that this woman's recipe is identical to one my mother was carrying when she disappeared while investigating corrupt railroad supply contracts. And now this woman's husband is dead after eating bitter meat from a railroad route you probably supplied. That's absurd. I supplied dozens of routes. There's no way to prove. Then you won't mind if I look at your shipping records. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara stood frozen, her mind racing. This wasn't what she'd expected. She'd come to Teller Ridge to win prize money, enough to survive the winter and maybe start over somewhere new. She'd entered the competition because her husband once told her that her cooking had kept him alive through storms that killed other men. She hadn't come looking for answers about how he died. But standing here watching Rowan Vale stare down a railroad contractor with the intensity of a man who'd spent 20 years searching for his mother's killer, Clara realized something had just shifted. This wasn't about a cooking competition anymore. This was about justice. Pritchard cleared his throat. Rowan, I think you're upset. I understand, but making accusations based on a recipe is disqualify her, Rowan said flatly. Clara's head snapped toward him. What? Disqualify her from the competition right now, then hire her. Pritchard blinked. Hire her? I need a cook at my lodge. She's got the skills. She can start tomorrow. Rowan, this is highly irregular. I don't care. Rowan's gaze shifted to Clara. You need money. I need someone who can cook survival rations for my hunting clients. The season runs through February, room and board included, plus wages. Enough to get you through winter and then some. Clara's mind spun. Why would you? Because you're the first person I've met in 20 years who knows my mother's recipe. Which means either your husband's family met her before she died, or someone else learned it and passed it down. Either way, you're the only lead I've had in 2 decades. I came here to compete. You came here because you're desperate. I'm offering you work. It wasn't a kind observation, it was a fact. Clara looked at the bowl of porridge cooling on the judge's table, then at Rowan Vale's cold, desperate eyes. Then at Jonas Pritchard, who looked like he'd just swallowed glass. She'd come to Teller Ridge with $43 and a recipe. She was leaving with a job and a mystery. All right, Clara said, I'll take the work. Rowan nodded once. Pack your things. We leave at first light. He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing into the darkness beyond the firelight. Pritchard stared after him, then looked at Clara. You don't know what you just agreed to. Neither do you, Clara replied. She picked up her bowl, turned, and walked back to her broken wagon. Behind her, the competition continued. The judges announced the winners, 3 men who'd cooked venison and rabbit and wild turkey. The crowd cheered. Prize money changed hands. Clara packed her supplies in silence. By the time the celebration ended and the fires burned low, she'd loaded everything she owned back into her wagon. The broken wheel didn't matter anymore. Rowan had said she'd leave at first light, which meant he had transportation. She lay down in the back of the wagon, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring up at stars that looked too bright and too cold. Her husband had died 6 months ago. She'd spent those 6 months surviving, barely, on work nobody else wanted. Washing clothes, cleaning stables, taking any job that paid enough for food and shelter. She hadn't cried at his funeral. She hadn't cried when she sold everything they owned except the cooking pot and the wagon. She hadn't cried when she realized she had nowhere left to go except west. Toward a cooking competition she had no real chance of winning. But lying there under the Colorado stars, thinking about a recipe her husband's family had learned from a woman who'd disappeared 20 years ago, Clara finally felt something crack open inside her chest. Not grief, something sharper. Anger. Because if Rowan Vale was right, if his mother had been investigating railroad corruption before she vanished, then maybe Clara's husband hadn't died from fever at all. Maybe he'd been poisoned. Maybe someone had been feeding contaminated meat to miners and railroad workers for decades, killing them slowly while men like Jonas Pritchard got rich off supply contracts nobody questioned. Maybe her husband had tasted that bitterness and known something was wrong but died before he could prove it. Clara's hands curled into fists inside her blanket. She'd come to Teller Ridge to survive, but maybe survival wasn't enough anymore. Maybe it was time to find out what really happened to the man she'd loved and the woman who'd taught his family how to stay alive when powerful men wanted them dead. The stars offered no answers. But come morning, Clara would follow Rowan Vale into the mountains. And somewhere in those peaks, buried beneath 20 years of silence and snow, the truth was waiting. Rowan's lodge sat 3 miles up a trail so narrow Clara thought the wagon might tip sideways into the gorge below. He drove without speaking, his hands steady on the reins even when the wheels caught on rocks that would have sent a less experienced driver into a panic. Clara gripped the seat and tried not to look down at the drop. The silence between them felt deliberate, not hostile, just empty, like Rowan had used up all his words the night before and had none left to spare. They'd left Teller Ridge before dawn. Clara had climbed onto his wagon with her pot and her supplies while the competition ground still lay dark and quiet. Rowan had glanced at her belongings once, said nothing about how little she owned, and snapped the reins. Now 4 hours later, the trees had grown thicker and the air had turned cold enough that Clara could see her breath. "How much further?" she asked. "Another hour." Those were the first words he'd spoken since they left. Clara shifted on the hard seat. "You get many guests up here?" "Enough." "What kind?" "The kind with money." She waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. "Right," Clara said. "I'll just shut up then." Rowan glanced at her. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face, but it died before it reached his eyes. "You always this talkative?" "Only when I'm sitting next to someone who hired me based on a bowl of porridge and a dead woman's recipe." The amusement vanished completely. Rowan turned his attention back to the trail. Clara instantly regretted the words. "I'm sorry, that was accurate," Rowan finished. "You're right. I hired you because I think you know something, maybe not on purpose. Maybe you don't even realize what you know, but that recipe didn't survive 20 years by accident. My husband's family said a woman taught it to them. When? Winter of 1860, same year your mother disappeared. Rowan's jaw tightened. Where? Wyoming Territory. Small camp near the Medicine Bow Range, That's 200 miles from where my mother was last seen. Maybe she traveled. She was investigating corruption. She wasn't teaching cooking lessons to random families. Clara felt something sharp in her chest. Maybe she did both. Maybe she knew she was in danger and wanted to make sure someone remembered what she'd learned. Rowan went quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough. She was 36 years old, best tracker I ever knew, could read weather patterns 3 days out and navigate by stars most sailors couldn't name. The railroad committee hired her because mine collapses kept happening near supply routes she'd flagged as suspicious. What kind of collapses? The kind where support beams rotted faster than they should have, where men got sick from bad air, where tunnel floods happened in dry seasons. Rowan guided the wagon around a switchback. She started asking questions about the lumber and meat contracts, about which suppliers were cutting corners. 2 weeks later, she went into the mountains to inspect a supply cache and never came back. They looked for her? For 3 days. Then a storm rolled in and the search ended. The committee said she'd gotten lost, froze to death. Case closed. You didn't believe them? No. Why not? Rowan's hands tightened on the reins. Because my mother didn't get lost. Ever. And because the night before she left, she told me that if anything happened to her, I should remember that powerful men protect their money harder than they protect the truth. Clara absorbed that. How old were you? 13. That's a hell of a thing to tell a kid. She wasn't wrong. The trail widened slightly as they climbed higher. Through gaps in the trees, Clara could see the valley spreading out below, a patchwork of brown and gold where autumn had already stripped the leaves. It would have been beautiful if she'd had any energy left to appreciate beauty. The lodge up ahead, Rowan said eventually. You'll have your own room. Kitchen's fully stocked. I've got 8 guests arriving in 3 days, railroad investors from Denver. They're paying for a 2-week hunting expedition with meals included. What do they hunt? Elk, mostly. Some bear if they're feeling ambitious. Mostly they drink whiskey and pretend they're frontiersmen. And you guide them. That's the job. Clara studied his profile. You don't like them much. I don't need to like them. I just need to keep them alive and take their money. Even if they're railroad men? Rowan's expression hardened. Especially if they're railroad men. The lodge appeared around the next bend, a low, sprawling structure built from timber and stone that looked like it had grown out of the mountain itself. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, a wide porch wrapped around the front, and behind it Clara could see smaller outbuildings that probably served as storage or guest quarters. It was bigger than she'd expected, more permanent. Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop near the main entrance. Welcome to Vale Lodge. You'll earn your keep here, but you won't go hungry. Clara climbed down, her legs stiff from the journey. Where do you want my things? I'll show you. He led her inside through a heavy wooden door that opened into a main room large enough to hold 30 people comfortably. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. Long tables and benches filled the center. The walls were lined with mounted elk heads, bearskins, and old rifles that looked more decorative than functional. It smelled like wood smoke and old leather, and something else Clara couldn't quite identify. Maybe just the accumulated scent of years and weather and men who'd come here to pretend they were harder than they actually were. Kitchen's through there. Rowan pointed to a doorway on the left. Your room's upstairs, second door. Guests sleep in the cabins out back. I'm in the room at the end of the hall if you need anything. What about help? You got anyone else working here? Had a man who handled firewood and basic repairs, but he quit last month. Couldn't handle the isolation. So right now it's just you and me until the guests arrive. Clara processed that. You're telling me I'm alone in the mountains with a man I just met, cooking for railroad investors you clearly hate, while trying to figure out if my dead husband was poisoned by the same people who might have killed your mother. Rowan almost smiled. That's about right. Fantastic. You can leave if you want. I'll pay you for the trip up and take you back down tomorrow. Clara looked around the lodge. It was solid, well built. The kind of place that could withstand winters that would crush lesser structures. And despite everything, despite the strangeness of the situation and the cold distance in Rowan's eyes, She felt something settle in her chest that might have been the beginning of safety. She'd been running for 6 months. Maybe it was time to stop. "I'll stay," Clara said. Rowan nodded once. "Good. Get settled. I'll bring your things up." He left before she could argue. Clara walked through the doorway into the kitchen and stopped. It was enormous. 2 large cast-iron stoves, a work table that could have seated 8 people, shelves lined with jars and tins and sacks of flour and cornmeal, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, a larder in the back stocked with preserved meat, smoked fish, and vegetables packed in salt. This wasn't just a kitchen. This was a fortress against hunger. Clara ran her hand along the work table. The wood was scarred from years of use, but clean and well-maintained. Someone had cared for this space. Someone who understood that good cooking required good tools and respect for the process. She wondered if Rowan's mother had worked here, if she'd stood in this exact spot, teaching her son how to turn raw ingredients into survival. The thought made Clara's throat tighten. Upstairs, she found her room. It was small but clean, a narrow bed, a trunk for storage, a window that looked out over the valley. She unpacked her few belongings and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. 6 months ago, she'd had a husband and a home and a future that looked something like happiness. Now she had a room in a mountain lodge and a mystery she hadn't asked for. She lay back on the bed and closed her eyes. When she woke, it was dark outside and someone was knocking on her door. "You alive in there?" Rowan's voice came through the wood. Clara sat up, disoriented. "Yeah. What time is it?" "Past 7. You slept through dinner. I saved you some stew." She opened the door. Rowan stood in the hallway holding a bowl and a spoon. He looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't used to taking care of people who weren't paying him. "Thanks," Clara said, taking the bowl. "It's not as good as what you made yesterday." "I'm sure it's fine." Rowan didn't leave. He stood there, clearly wanting to say something, but not sure how to start. Clara took a bite of the stew. It was fine. Basic, functional, exactly the kind of food a man like Rowan would make when he needed fuel and nothing else. "You want to ask me something," Clara said. "Yeah." "So ask." Rowan leaned against the doorframe. "Your husband. Tell me about him." Clara set the bowl down. "Why?" "Because if he died the way I think he did, then he's connected to my mother, and I need to know everything." Clara's chest tightened. Talking about Thomas always felt like opening a wound that hadn't quite healed, but she understood what Rowan was asking. This wasn't about grief. This was about evidence. "His name was Thomas Whitmore," she began. "We met in Wyoming 5 years ago. He was working freight routes, hauling supplies between mining camps and railroad depots. Good man, honest. The kind who'd give you his last dollar if he thought you needed it more than him." "What routes did he work?" "Northern Pacific Extension, mostly. Sometimes Union Pacific if they needed extra drivers. He was reliable, so companies kept hiring him back." "Did he ever mention problems with the cargo?" Clara thought back. "Not until the end. Last winter he came home from a 3-week haul complaining about the meat. Said it tasted off, metallic. We figured it was just poor preservation. Happens sometimes when shipments sit too long in cold weather. But it wasn't. No." 2 days later he got sick. Fever, vomiting, pain in his gut that wouldn't stop. We got him to a doctor in Laramie, but by then it was too late. The doctor said it was fever, maybe pneumonia, something that had gotten into his lungs and wouldn't let go. Did the doctor test for poisoning? Why would he? Thomas was a freight driver, not someone important enough to murder. Rowan's expression darkened. That's exactly why they'd get away with it. Clara picked up her bowl again, more to have something to hold than because she was hungry. "You really think someone poisoned him?" "I think someone's been poisoning railroad workers for 20 years and nobody's noticed because the deaths look like accidents or natural causes. Bad meat, spoiled supplies, contaminated water. It's the perfect crime because the victims are scattered across territories and nobody connects the pattern." "But why? What's the point?" "Control," Rowan said flatly. "You poison enough men, you create fear. Workers start refusing certain routes. Camps shut down. Suddenly the railroad needs new suppliers, ones who can guarantee safe deliveries, and those suppliers charge premium rates." Clara felt sick. "That's insane. That's business. My mother figured it out." She tracked shipment records and found that every major incident, every collapse, every outbreak, every unexplained death, Happened within 2 weeks of a delivery from the same 3 contractors. Let me guess. Jonas Pritchard was one of them. He's the biggest, but he's not working alone. Clara set the bowl down again. Her appetite had completely vanished. So what do? We find proof. Real proof. Not just suspicions and dead people. We need documents, shipping records, chemical analyses, something concrete enough that even wealthy men can't bury it. And you think I can help with that? Rowan straightened from the doorframe. I think you know how to survive in places most people would quit. I think you're smart enough to see patterns. And I think you've got a reason to want these bastards exposed just as much as I do. He wasn't wrong. Clara stood up. When do we start? The investors arrive in 3 days. You cook for them, keep them happy, make them think this is just another hunting trip. Meanwhile, I'll go through their belongings. You're going to rob your own guests? I'm going to see what they're carrying. These men work for railroad companies. If there's evidence, they'll have it. Clara crossed her arms. And if they catch you? They won't. You sound awfully confident for someone planning to commit a felony. Rowan's cold eyes met hers. I've been planning this for 20 years. I'm not going to fail now. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Clara threw herself into the kitchen work with an intensity that surprised even her. She baked bread, prepared stews, organized the larder, and planned meals that would keep 8 wealthy men comfortable enough to lower their guard. Rowan worked outside, chopping firewood and repairing trail markers and doing all the things a mountain guide does when he's about to host people who expect nature to be dangerous but not inconvenient. They barely spoke, but every evening, Rowan would appear in the kitchen with some small piece of information he'd uncovered. A name scribbled in an old ledger, a supply route his mother had flagged decades ago, a connection between contractors that didn't make sense unless you assumed they were coordinating. Clara listened, asked questions, started building a mental map of the conspiracy Rowan believed had killed his mother and her husband. It was monstrous, and it was starting to make sense. On the 3rd evening, Clara was rolling out pie dough when Rowan walked in carrying a wooden crate. "What's that?" she asked. "Samples." He set the crate on the work table and pried open the lid. Inside were glass jars filled with preserved meat, the kind railroad companies shipped to remote camps by the ton. Clara wiped flour from her hands. "Where'd you get these?" "Supply cache about 2 miles east. It's been abandoned for 6 months, but the jars are still sealed." "And you think they're contaminated?" "I think they're evidence." Rowan pulled out one of the jars and held it up to the light. The meat inside looked normal, dark red chunks packed in brine. But when he unscrewed the lid, Clara caught a smell that made her stomach turn. Bitter. Metallic. Exactly how Thomas had described it. "That's the same smell," Clara whispered. Rowan's expression turned grim. "Then we need to test it. See what's actually in here." "How?" "I know a chemist in Boulder, former mining engineer. He owes me a favor." Rowan sealed the jar again. "I'll take a sample down next week after the guests settle in. If there's poison in this meat, he'll find it." Clara stared at the jars. "And if he does?" "Then we'll have proof that someone's been contaminating railroad supplies. We'll have something to take to federal investigators." "You think they'll care?" "I think they'll have to. This isn't just about dead workers anymore. This is about a conspiracy that's been running for 2 decades. That's the kind of scandal newspapers love." Clara wanted to believe him, but she'd seen enough of how the world worked to know that powerful men rarely faced consequences for crimes against people nobody cared about. Still, she nodded. "All right, we'll get your proof. We'll get justice." "Maybe," Clara said quietly, "if we're lucky." Rowan picked up the crate. "Luck's got nothing to do with it. This is about being smarter than they are, more patient, more careful." He carried the crate out of the kitchen, leaving Clara alone with her pie dough and the bitter smell that lingered in the air. The investors arrived the next afternoon in 2 wagons loaded with enough gear to outfit a military expedition. Clara watched from the kitchen window as they climbed down. 8 men in expensive coats and polished boots, laughing and slapping each other's backs like they were heading to a social club instead of a wilderness lodge. Rowan greeted them with the practiced warmth of someone who'd done this 100 times. He shook hands, helped unload luggage, directed them toward their cabins. His whole demeanor had changed. The cold, distant man Clara had traveled with was gone, replaced by a confident guide who promised adventure and comfort in equal measure. It was unsettling how easily he switched between the two versions of himself. That evening, Clara served dinner in the main lodge. Roasted venison with root vegetables, fresh bread, apple pie for dessert. The kind of meal that reminded wealthy men why they paid premium rates for wilderness experiences. The investors ate like they'd never seen food before. "Outstanding," one of them declared, waving his fork. "Rowan, where'd you find this cook?" "Teller Ridge competition," Rowan said smoothly. "She placed higher than half the men there." That wasn't technically true, but Clara didn't correct him. Another man, older, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd spent his life telling other people what to do, looked at Clara with open curiosity. "You worked railroad camps before?" "My late husband did," Clara replied. "I learned from feeding him and his crew." "Ah, sorry for your loss." The words were automatic, meaningless. The kind of thing rich men said when death was mentioned, but they didn't actually care. Clara nodded and retreated to the kitchen. Behind her, the conversation continued. The men talked about markets and shipping routes and profit margins. They talked about expansion opportunities and labor costs and which territories offered the best return on investment. They talked about people like they were cargo. Clara cleaned dishes and listened. One name kept coming up, Jonas Pritchard. Apparently he was supposed to join this expedition, but had canceled at the last minute. Business in Denver. Something about a supply contract that needed immediate attention. The silver-haired man seemed annoyed. "That's the third time Jonas has backed out this year. I'm starting to think he's avoiding us." "Can you blame him?" another voice said. "After that incident at Teller Ridge, I heard some woman accused him of running contaminated shipments. That's nonsense. Jonas runs the cleanest operation in Colorado." "Still, bad optics, having a widow publicly question your supply chain." Clara's hands stilled in the wash basin. They were talking about her. "Rowan handled it well," the silver-haired man continued. "Hired the woman, got her out of the way. Smart move." "You think that's why he did it?" "What else? Vale's not the charitable type." Laughter rippled through the room. Clara dried her hands and walked back to the doorway. The men had moved on to talking about hunting strategies. None of them looked at her. She was invisible to them. Just the help. Later that night, after the investors had retired to their cabins and the lodge had gone quiet, Clara found Rowan on the porch. He stood at the railing, staring out at the dark mountains. "They think you hired me to shut me up," Clara said. Rowan didn't turn around. "Let them think that." "Does it bother you?" "No. It bothers me." Now he looked at her. "Why?" "You know the truth. That's all that matters." Clara leaned against the railing beside him. "They talked about Jonas Pritchard. Said he was supposed to be here but canceled." "I know. He sent word 2 days ago." "You think he's worried?" "I think he's smart enough to know that recipe meant something, and I think he's covering his tracks." Clara watched her breath form clouds in the cold air. What if we can't prove anything? What if all we find are suspicions and coincidences? Rowan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Clara's chest tighten. "Then we keep looking, because the alternative is letting them win, and I've spent 20 years refusing to do that. That's a long time to carry anger. It's not anger anymore, it's just who I am." Clara understood that. She'd only been carrying her grief for 6 months, and already it had changed her into someone harder, someone less trusting, someone who saw corruption in places she used to see only coincidence. "Your mother would be proud of you," Clara said quietly. Rowan's jaw clenched. "My mother would tell me I'm being reckless, that going after powerful men without ironclad proof is suicide. Is she wrong? Probably not. But you're doing it anyway." "Yeah." "Why?" Rowan finally looked at her fully. In the moonlight, his face looked older, exhausted, like he'd been fighting this battle so long he couldn't remember what peace felt like. "Because if I don't," he said, "then she disappeared for nothing, and I can't accept that." Clara nodded slowly. She thought about Thomas, about the way he died in pain, confused about why his body was failing him, about how she'd buried him without ever knowing the real cause. She thought about the recipe his family had learned from a woman who'd tried to expose the truth 20 years ago. And she thought about the men sleeping in cabins behind the lodge, men who talked about human lives like they were numbers in a ledger. I'm with you, Clara said. Whatever it takes. Rowan studied her face. You sure about that? No, but I'm doing it anyway. Something almost like respect flickered across Rowan's expression. Then we'd better make sure we don't get caught. He pushed off the railing and headed back inside. Clara stayed on the porch, watching stars she couldn't name scattered across a sky too vast to comprehend. Somewhere in these mountains, the truth was buried, and Clara was going to dig it up, even if it meant tearing apart the foundations of an empire built on poisoned meat and dead workers nobody remembered. The investors spent their first week hunting. Every morning, they'd ride out into the high country with Rowan leading them toward elk herds he'd tracked for years. Every evening, they'd return tired and loud, carrying stories about shots they'd missed and animals that got away. Clara would have dinner waiting, venison stew, roasted quail, whatever they'd managed to kill that day prepared in ways that made them feel like conquerors. She smiled, served, listened, and while they ate, Rowan searched their rooms. He never told her what he found, but every night after the investors retired to their cabins, he'd appear in the kitchen with that same grim expression that meant he'd come up empty again. No shipping records, no contaminated samples, no letters discussing supply routes or contract negotiations. Nothing. They're cleaner than I expected, Rowan said on the 8th night. He sat at the kitchen work table while Clara kneaded dough for tomorrow's bread. Either they don't carry evidence with them, or they're smart enough to keep it somewhere we can't access. Maybe they're not involved, Clara suggested, though she didn't believe it. They're involved. I've heard them talking. They know exactly which routes are profitable and which ones lose money. They know which contractors deliver on time and which ones cut corners. They just don't talk about why. Clara punched the dough harder than necessary. So we're stuck. For now. That's not good enough. Rowan looked up at her. What do you want me to do? I can't force them to confess. No, but we can make them uncomfortable. How? Clara shaped the dough into a ball and set it aside to rise. You said your mother was investigating supply chain corruption, which means she had to have kept records somewhere. Notes, evidence, something she could present to the railroad committee. If she did, they disappeared with her. Or they're still out there, hidden somewhere nobody thought to look. Rowan stood up slowly. What are you saying? I'm saying your mother knew she was in danger. She told you that the night before she left, which means she probably took precautions. Like what? Like leaving a trail. Something you'd understand, but nobody else would. Rowan's expression shifted. Not hope. That would have been too much. But something close. You think she left me a message? I think she was smart enough to know that if she didn't come back, someone would eventually need to finish what she started. And she'd want that person to be you. Rowan sat back down. His hands were shaking slightly, the first time Clara had seen him show any physical sign of emotion. I looked, he said quietly. After she disappeared, I tore apart our house searching for anything she might have left behind. I found nothing. Maybe you weren't looking in the right place. Where else would I look? Clara wiped flour from her hands. Where did she spend most of her time? Here, in this lodge. She worked as a cook before the railroad committee hired her. So she knew this building, every corner, every hiding spot. Yeah. Then that's where we start. Rowan stared at the work table. I've lived here for 20 years. If there was something hidden, I would have found it. Unless you weren't supposed to find it until you knew what you were looking for. The silence that followed felt heavy. Clara could see Rowan's mind working through possibilities, rejecting most of them, clinging to the few that made sense. Finally, he stood up. Come with me. He led her upstairs to the end of the hall where his room sat behind a plain wooden door. Clara had never been inside. It felt like crossing a boundary she wasn't sure she had permission to cross. The room was sparse. A bed, a trunk, a small desk with papers scattered across it, maps on the walls showing mountain ranges and supply routes marked in faded ink. Rowan went to the closet and pulled out a wooden box. He set it on the bed and opened it carefully, like he was handling something fragile. Inside were personal things. A woman's shawl, a small leather journal with pages yellowed by time, a tin compass, a photograph of a young woman standing in front of this very lodge, her hand shading her eyes from the sun. That's her, Rowan said. That's my mother. Clara studied the photograph. The woman looked strong, capable, the kind of person who could survive winters that killed weaker people. She looks like you, Claire said. Everyone said that. Rowan picked up the journal and flipped through it slowly. I've read this 100 times. It's just daily entries. Weather observations, cooking notes. Nothing about the investigation. Clara took the journal from his hands. The entries were written in neat, precise handwriting. Most were mundane, recipes, supply lists, comments about guests who'd stayed at the lodge. But as Clara read through them, she noticed something strange. Certain words were underlined, not obviously, just a faint line beneath random words scattered throughout different entries. Look at this, Clara said, pointing to one page. Rowan leaned closer. What am I looking at? These underlines, they're not random. How do you know? Because they're consistent. Same pressure, same length. Your mother was marking something. Rowan grabbed the journal back and flipped through it faster. You're right, there's at least one underlined word on every page for the last 3 months before she disappeared. Write them down, in order. They spent the next hour transcribing every underlined word onto a fresh piece of paper. When they finished, they had a list of 47 words that made no sense together. Cache, north, creek, below, boulder, east, 3, miles, look, under, stone, marked, symbol, circle, inside, cross. Clara stared at the words. It's directions. To what? To wherever she hid the evidence. Rowan read through the list again. His hands had stopped shaking. Cache North Creek below Boulder East, 3 miles. Look under stone-marked symbol circle inside cross. There's a creek north of here? Yeah, White Creek. Runs about 4 miles north through a canyon. And boulders? Hundreds of them. That whole canyon is nothing but rock. Clara felt her excitement dimming. So we're looking for one specific boulder marked with a circle and cross, somewhere along a 4-mile stretch of creek bed. Sounds about right. That could take weeks. Then we'd better start looking. But they couldn't start looking immediately because the investors were still here and Rowan couldn't disappear without raising suspicion. So they waited. Clara cooked. Rowan guided. And every night they studied that list of words, trying to narrow down the location. On the 10th day, one of the investors asked Clara a question that changed everything. His name was Martin Cheswick, silver-haired, mid-50s, the kind of man who spoke softly but expected everyone to listen. He'd been quieter than the others during meals, more observant. Clara had noticed him watching her work with an intensity that felt different from the casual dismissal the other men showed. He found her in the kitchen late one afternoon while she was preparing dinner. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said from the doorway. Clara looked up from the vegetables she was chopping. "Mr. Cheswick, can I help you?" "I hope so. May I come in?" "Of course." He entered slowly, his eyes scanning the kitchen like he was cataloging every detail. "This is quite an operation you're running here." "Thank you." "You learned all this from your husband?" "And from necessity." Cheswick nodded. He picked up a jar of preserved meat from the shelf and examined the label. "These are from Pritchard's company." Clara's knife paused mid-cut. "Are they?" "Yes. I recognize the seal. Jonas supplies most of the mountain lodges in Colorado." He set the jar down. "He also supplied the route your husband was working when he died." Clara's pulse quickened. "How do you know that?" "Because I own the railroad company that contracted him. Northern Pacific Extension, correct?" Clara set the knife down carefully. "You're telling me you're the one who hired Thomas?" "Not personally, but yes, my company employed him." Cheswick's expression remained neutral. "I was very sorry to hear about his death. He was a good worker, reliable. He was a good man." "I'm sure he was." Cheswick moved closer to the work table. "The thing is, Mrs. Whitmore, I've been hearing rumors about contaminated shipments, about workers getting sick from preserved meat that tastes bitter." Clara forced herself to stay calm. "I don't know anything about that." "Don't you? Because at Teller Ridge, you made quite an accusation against Jonas Pritchard, in front of witnesses." "I didn't accuse anyone of anything." "No, but Rowan Vale did. Right after tasting your recipe." Cheswick leaned against the work table. "That recipe apparently belonged to his mother, who disappeared while investigating my company's supply contracts 20 years ago." Claire's throat went dry. I still don't understand what you want. I want to know if you have proof. Proof of what? That Jonas Pritchard has been contaminating railroad supplies. That he's been poisoning workers to drive up demand for his premium contracts. That he's been doing this for decades while men like me turned a blind eye because the profits were too good to question. The words hung in the air between them. Clara couldn't breathe. Cheswick straightened up. I'm not a good man, Mrs. Whitmore. I've made my fortune by being ruthless when necessary and asking fewer questions than I should. But I'm also not stupid. I've been watching the patterns for years, the incidents, the deaths, the convenient timing of contract renewals. Then why haven't you said anything? Because suspicion isn't proof. And without proof, all I'd accomplish is making myself a target. He walked to the window and stared out at the mountains. But if someone were to provide evidence, real, undeniable evidence, then I'd have the leverage I need to force a federal investigation. Why are you telling me this? Cheswick turned back to face her. Because Rowan Vale has been searching my room every night for the past week. He's careful, but not careful enough. And I'm guessing he's looking for exactly the kind of proof I'm talking about. Clara felt her stomach drop. He's just, don't bother lying. I know what he's doing. I know why he's doing it. And frankly, I don't blame him. Cheswick crossed his arms. What I want to know is whether you two have found anything. Clara made a decision. Not yet, but we have a lead. What kind of lead? The kind that might tell us where Rowan's mother hid her investigation records before she disappeared. Cheswick's eyes narrowed. Where? I'm not telling you that until I know I can trust you. You can't. Not completely. But I'm offering you something valuable. Protection. If you find evidence and bring it to me, I'll make sure it reaches the right people. I'll use my connections to force an investigation that Jonas can't bury. And what do you get out of this? Plausible deniability. I get to be the hero who exposed corruption instead of the man who profited from it for 20 years. Cheswick smiled, but there was no humor in it. Self-preservation, Mrs. Whitmore. It's a powerful motivator. Clara studied his face. Everything about this felt wrong. But she also knew they needed someone with power on their side. Someone who could make sure the evidence didn't disappear the moment they found it. I need to talk to Rowan, Clara said. Of course, but talk quickly. The other investors leave in 4 days. After that, Jonas is scheduled to arrive for a private meeting with me. If you're going to move, it needs to be before he gets here. Why would Jonas come here? Because I told him I wanted to renegotiate our supply contracts. He thinks I'm going to give him more business. Cheswick's expression hardened. Instead, I'm going to give him a choice. Confess everything or face federal investigators with whatever evidence you manage to find. That's a big gamble. It's the only move I have left. After Cheswick left, Clara stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. Her hands were shaking. She'd just made an alliance with a railroad investor who'd admitted to profiting from corruption for decades. A man who wasn't offering help out of guilt or morality, but out of pure self-interest. But maybe that didn't matter. Maybe all that mattered was getting justice for Thomas and for Rowan's mother and for all the other people who died because powerful men cared more about money than human lives. That night, she told Rowan everything. He didn't explode the way she expected. Instead, he sat very still and listened while Clara explained Cheswick's offer. When she finished, his face was unreadable. He's using us, Rowan said finally. I know. If we fail, he walks away clean. If we succeed, he gets credit for exposing the corruption. I know that too. And you still think we should work with him? Clara met his eyes. I think we need him. We can find the evidence, but without someone powerful enough to make sure it matters, we're just two people shouting into the wind. Rowan stood up and paced the length of the kitchen. My mother spent years building a case. She collected testimony, tracked shipments, documented everything. And it didn't matter because the moment she became a threat, they made her disappear. That's why we need Cheswick. He's already implicated. If he goes down, he wants to take Jonas with him. That makes him invested in seeing this through. Or it makes him dangerous. He could easily hand us over to Jonas the moment he sees what we've found. He could, but I don't think he will. Why not? Clara chose her words carefully, because I saw his face when he talked about the deaths. He knows what he's been part of, and I think some part of him, maybe a very small part, actually wants to fix it. Rowan stopped pacing. You're giving him too much credit. Maybe, but we're out of options. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Rowan exhaled slowly. All right, we find the cash. We see what my mother left behind. And then we decide whether Cheswick gets to see it. Fair enough. But Clara, Rowan's voice dropped. If this goes wrong, we're not just risking our lives. We're risking the only chance we'll ever have to prove what happened. I know. And you're willing to take that risk? Clara thought about Thomas, about the way he'd died confused and in pain, about the 6 months she'd spent since then, surviving but never really living. Yeah, she said, I am. They left before dawn 2 days later, while the investors were still asleep and the mountains were dark and quiet. Rowan led the way on horseback with Clara riding behind him, both of them carrying packs loaded with supplies in case the search took longer than expected. White Creek lay 4 miles north through terrain so rough that Clara wondered how anyone could have hidden something there deliberately. The canyon was all sharp rocks and steep drops and trees growing at angles that suggested they were barely holding on. They reached the creek bed by mid-morning. The water ran fast and cold, cutting through stone that looked older than memory. We start here and work east, Rowan said, dismounting. Look for any boulder with a marking. Circle inside a cross. Could be carved, could be painted, could be anything. They searched for hours. Every boulder started to look the same. Every shadow could have been a marking. Claire's back ached from climbing over rocks. Her hands were scraped and bleeding from where she'd caught herself during falls. By afternoon, she was ready to give up. Then Rowan shouted. Clara scrambled toward his voice and found him standing beside a boulder the size of a small cabin. On its eastern face, barely visible beneath moss and lichen, was a mark, a circle, with a cross inside it. Here, Rowan breathed. It's here. They spent the next hour searching around the boulder, looking under rocks, digging in the dirt, finding nothing. Maybe she didn't actually hide something, Clara said finally. Maybe this was just a marker, a way to remember something. No. Rowan's voice was tight. She wouldn't have gone to this trouble for a marker. There's something here. He ran his hands along the boulder's surface, feeling for seams or cracks. Clara watched him work with desperate intensity, like a man running out of time. Then his hands stopped. Here, there's a gap. Clara moved closer. Rowan had found a narrow crack between the boulder and another rock wedged beneath it. The gap was barely wide enough for a hand. Rowan reached inside. His expression changed. What is it? Clara whispered. Metal. There's a metal box. He pulled carefully. The box scraped against stone. For a terrible moment, Clara thought it was stuck. Then it came free. A flat tin container about the size of a book, rusted at the edges but still sealed. Rowan set it on the ground between them. His hands were shaking again. Open it, Clara said. Rowan pried at the lid. It resisted. He pulled harder. The seal broke with a sound like tearing paper. Inside were documents, old papers wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture and time. Rowan unwrapped them slowly. Shipping ledgers, chemical analyses, testimony statements from miners who'd survived contaminated food, letters between railroad executives discussing supply optimization, contracts with Pritchard's name signed at the bottom, and in the middle of it all, a handwritten note in the same neat script from the journal. If you're reading this, then something happened to me. Don't let them bury the truth with my body. Make them answer for what they've done. I love you. Be stronger than I was. Rowan's face crumpled. For the first time since Clara had met him, he cried. She didn't try to comfort him. She just sat beside him while he held his mother's final words and let 20 years of grief finally break through. When he could speak again, his voice was raw. She knew. She knew they'd kill her, and she hid the evidence anyway. She wanted you to finish it. I was 13 years old. What was I supposed to do? Exactly what you're doing now. Rowan wiped his face roughly. We need to get this back to the lodge. We need to show Cheswick. Are you sure? No, but my mother risked everything for this evidence. I'm not going to let it sit in a box for another 20 years. They rode back faster than they'd come, the metal container secured in Rowan's pack. By the time they reached the lodge, the sun was setting and the investors were gathered in the main room for dinner. Clara served them mechanically, her mind elsewhere. After the meal, she found Cheswick alone on the porch. We found it, she said quietly. Cheswick's expression didn't change. Show me. In Rowan's room, they spread the documents across the desk. Cheswick read through them slowly, his face growing paler with each page. Finally, he looked up. This is everything. Names, dates, financial records, testimony. This is enough to destroy Jonas and everyone else involved. Including you, Rowan said flatly. Including me, Cheswick agreed, which is why I'm going to use it to negotiate immunity. I give federal investigators this evidence and testify against the others, and I walk away with my fortune intact. That's not justice. No, but it's the only way this ends without you two disappearing like Rowan's mother did. Cheswick began gathering the papers. Jonas arrives in 2 days. I'll confront him with this. Get his confession on record. Then we take everything to the authorities. And if he doesn't confess? Claire asked. Cheswick smiled grimly. Then we'll make sure the newspapers get this evidence instead. Either way, his empire falls. After Cheswick left, Claire and Rowan sat in silence. We just handed everything to a man we don't trust, Rowan said. I know. If this goes wrong, it won't. You can't know that. Clara looked at him. No, but I know your mother didn't hide those documents for nothing, and I know my husband didn't die for nothing, and I know that whatever happens next, we're closer to the truth than anyone's been in 20 years. Rowan nodded slowly. Yeah, we are. 2 days later, Jonas Pritchard arrived at Vale Lodge, and everything Clara thought she knew about survival was about to change. Jonas Pritchard arrived in a private coach with 2 armed men riding beside him. Clara watched from the kitchen window as he climbed down, brushing trail dust from his expensive coat like it personally offended him. He looked older than he had at Teller Ridge, more tired, with lines around his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Good, Clara thought. Rowan met him at the lodge entrance with the same practiced warmth he'd shown the other investors. They shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, acted like nothing was wrong. Clara turned back to her work. Tonight's dinner needed to be perfect. Cheswick had insisted on a formal banquet. All 8 remaining investors plus Jonas, seated at the long table in the main room. He'd called it a celebration of their successful hunting expedition. Clara knew what it really was. A trap. She spent the afternoon preparing dishes that would keep the men at the table for hours. Roasted elk with herb crust, buttered potatoes, fresh bread, 3 kinds of pie. The kind of meal that made people comfortable and careless. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. The men gathered in the main room, their voices loud with whiskey and self-satisfaction. Clara served the first course while they talked about markets and profit margins and expansion opportunities. Normal conversation. Nothing that suggested anyone suspected what was coming. Jonas sat at the head of the table beside Cheswick. He looked relaxed, confident. A man who believed he'd already won whatever game was being played. Clara poured wine and listened. Halfway through the meal, Cheswick stood up. He tapped his glass with a knife until the room went quiet. Gentlemen, I want to thank you all for joining me this week. It's been productive, profitable, everything we hoped for. He smiled. But before we conclude our business, there's one matter that requires our attention. Jonas looked up. What matter? A matter of supply chain integrity. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Jonas's smile didn't waver. I'm not sure what you mean, Martin. I think you do. Cheswick reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. He set it on the table in front of Jonas. This is a chemical analysis of preserved meat from your company's shipments, dated 1879. It shows traces of arsenic and lead at levels high enough to cause severe illness over extended exposure. Jonas stared at the paper without touching it. That's a very serious accusation. It's not an accusation, it's a fact. One document from 4 years ago proves nothing. Contamination happens. It's an unfortunate reality of frontier preservation. You're right, one document proves nothing. Cheswick pulled out another paper, then another, then a whole stack of them, spreading them across the table like cards. But 14 chemical analyses spanning 12 years? That's not contamination, that's deliberate. The other investors had gone silent. They stared at the documents with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror. Jonas's face remained calm, but Clara saw his hands clench beneath the table. Where did you get these? Does it matter? It matters if you're basing business decisions on forged evidence. These aren't forged. Their testimony gathered by a railroad investigator named Margaret Vale. Perhaps you remember her. She disappeared in 1860 while looking into supply chain corruption. Something flickered across Jonas's face. Not guilt, calculation. He was trying to figure out how much Cheswick actually knew. I remember the investigation, Jonas said carefully. It found no evidence of wrongdoing. The committee cleared all contractors involved. The committee closed the investigation after Margaret Vale vanished. They didn't clear anyone. They just stopped looking. Cheswick leaned forward. But Margaret didn't stop. She kept gathering evidence right up until the day she died. And now that evidence is on this table. Jonas finally picked up one of the documents. He read it slowly, his expression revealing nothing. When he set it down, his voice was cold. This is very impressive, Martin, but it's also ancient history. These analyses are from the 1860s and 70s. My company has changed significantly since then. Our processes have improved. Whatever happened back then, if anything happened, has no bearing on current operations. Really? Because I have testimony from miners who got sick last winter from your meat shipments. Same symptoms, same bitter taste, same everything. Hearsay. Patterns. Jonas stood up. I think this dinner is over. Sit down, Jonas. The command in Cheswick's voice made everyone freeze. Even Jonas hesitated before slowly lowering himself back into his chair. You're going to sit here, Cheswick continued, and you're going to explain to everyone at this table exactly how your contamination scheme works. How you deliberately poisoned railroad workers to drive demand for premium contracts. How you made millions while men died in mining camps and blamed it on bad luck. I don't have to explain anything to you. No, but you'll explain it to federal investigators, unless you prefer I send this evidence to the newspapers first. Jonas's composure finally cracked. You do that, and you'll destroy yourself along with me. Your company bought half those contaminated shipments. You knew the meat was killing people, and you kept ordering it because it was cheap. I suspected. I didn't know. There's a difference. Not in a courtroom, there isn't. Cheswick smiled, and Clara realized he'd been waiting for exactly this response. You're right, which is why I've already negotiated immunity in exchange for my testimony. The federal prosecutor is very interested in bringing charges against you. All I need to do is deliver you and this evidence. The room erupted. The other investors started talking over each other, some demanding explanations, others frantically trying to distance themselves from whatever scandal was unfolding. One man stood up and announced he was leaving immediately. Jonas sat perfectly still, his face white with rage. Clara stood by the kitchen door, forgotten in the chaos. She watched Rowan, who'd positioned himself near the main entrance. Their eyes met across the room. He gave her a tiny nod. Everything was going according to plan. Then Jonas laughed. The sound cut through the noise like a knife. Everyone stopped talking. You think you've won, Jonas said quietly. You think you've outsmarted me with old documents and moral outrage, but you've forgotten something important, Martin. What's that? I'm not the only one involved. I never was. Jonas gestured at the men around the table. Every person in this room has profited from my contracts. You've all looked the other way while I cut costs and maximized efficiency. You've all cashed checks that were paid for with dead workers. That's not true, someone protested weakly. Isn't it? Tell me, Richard, how did you think I kept my prices so low? Magic? Jonas turned to another investor. And you, Thomas, you personally negotiated rates that were impossible to achieve with legitimate preservation methods. Did you think I was just being generous? The silence that followed was absolute. Jonas stood up again, and this time no one tried to stop him. You want to destroy me? Fine. But I'm taking all of you down with me. Every contract, every shipment, every death. I kept records too, Martin. Very detailed records about who knew what and when they knew it. Cheswick's face had gone pale. You're bluffing. Am I? The moment federal investigators start looking into my operation, they'll find purchase orders signed by your company, letters discussing cost reduction strategies, memos questioning meat quality that you ignored because the profit margins were too good. You think immunity will protect you from that? I have Margaret Vale's evidence, and I have 20 years of business correspondence implicating you and everyone else at this table. Jonas pulled on his coat. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me those documents, all of them. And in return, I'll keep your names out of the newspapers when this inevitably explodes. That's extortion. That's survival. Something you should understand given your current situation. Claire's mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Jonas was supposed to panic, confess, give them something they could use. Instead, he'd turned the entire confrontation into a stalemate where everyone lost. Then Rowan spoke. "You killed my mother." Everyone turned to look at him. Jonas's expression flickered with something that might have been recognition. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Margaret Vale, the investigator who gathered all that evidence. You killed her." "I never touched Margaret Vale." "No, you had someone else do it." Rowan walked slowly toward the table. "My mother told me the night before she disappeared that she'd found proof of contamination. She was going to present it to the committee the following week, but she never got the chance because someone made sure she didn't come back from the mountains." Jonas's jaw tightened. "That's a very serious accusation." "It's the truth, and you're going to admit it." "Why would I do that?" "Because if you don't, I'm going to make sure you never leave this mountain alive." The threat hung in the air like smoke. One of Jonas's guards reached for his weapon. Rowan didn't move. He just stared at Jonas with cold, dead eyes that said he'd been waiting 20 years for this moment and wasn't afraid of what happened next. "Rowan," Cheswick said carefully, "let's not do anything rash." "Rash? My mother died investigating this man's crimes. My entire life has been built around that loss. And you want me to stay calm? I want you to stay smart. We have evidence. We have leverage. We don't need violence. Evidence doesn't bring back the dead." Jonas finally showed real fear. Clara could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his eyes darted toward the door, calculating distances. "I didn't kill your mother," Jonas said quickly. "I swear. I had nothing to do with her death." "You're lying." "I'm not. Yes, I knew about the investigation. Yes, I was worried about what she'd find, but I didn't hire anyone to hurt her. She died in a storm. It was an accident. Convenient accident. It was tragic, but it wasn't murder." Rowan took another step forward. "Then who? Who else knew she was getting close?" Jonas hesitated. Clara saw the calculation in his eyes, weighing what he could admit without destroying himself completely. "There were others," Jonas said finally. "Railroad executives who had more to lose than I did, men who stood to lose their positions if a corruption scandal went public." "Names." "I don't have names. I was just a contractor. I didn't know who they talked to or what arrangements they made." "You expect me to believe that?" "Believe whatever you want, but I'm telling you the truth. I contaminated meat to cut costs. I bribed inspectors to look the other way. I falsified shipping records. I did all of that. But I didn't kill your mother." The room had gone completely silent. Clara watched the investors' faces. Some looked genuinely shocked. Others looked sick. A few looked like they were calculating how fast they could leave without drawing attention. Cheswick broke the silence. "If you're telling the truth, then you'll testify. You'll give investigators the names of everyone involved, contractors, executives, inspectors, all of them. In exchange, maybe the prosecutor will consider a reduced sentence." Jonas laughed bitterly. "A reduced sentence? How generous." "It's better than hanging." "Is it? I'd spend the rest of my life in prison while men who profited even more than I did walk free. That's not justice. That's just revenge dressed up in legal proceedings." "Then what do you want?" Clara asked. Everyone turned to look at her. She'd been so quiet they'd almost forgotten she was there. Jonas studied her face. "You're the widow from Teller Ridge, the one with the recipe." "I am." "Your husband died from my meat." "He did." "And you want me to pay for that?" "I want you to tell the truth. I want the families who lost people to know what really happened. I want the workers who are still eating contaminated food to be warned before it's too late." Clara moved closer to the table. "I don't care about revenge. I care about stopping this from happening to anyone else." Jonas looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite guilt, but maybe exhaustion. Like he'd been carrying a weight for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be free. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll tell you everything." Over the next 3 hours, Jonas talked. He explained how the contamination scheme had started small, just cutting corners on preservation to save money. But then he'd realized that slight contamination actually created more demand. Workers would get sick, camps would panic, and suddenly everyone was willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed safe shipments. So he'd made it systematic. Enough arsenic and lead to cause problems, but not enough to kill people immediately. Spread out over months and years. Deaths that looked like illness or accident or bad luck. He'd bribed inspectors, falsified test results, paid railroad executives to ignore complaints, built an entire infrastructure around selling poison to people desperate enough to eat it. And he'd made millions. The investors listened in horror. Several of them had gone pale. One man actually vomited in the corner. Clara listened too, her hands clenched so tight her nails cut into her palms. Every word Jonas spoke was another confirmation of what she'd suspected. Thomas hadn't died from fever. He'd been killed slowly by meat that tasted bitter because it was contaminated deliberately. When Jonas finally finished talking, Cheswick stood up. "You're under citizen's arrest. Rowan, tie him up. We're taking him to the federal marshal in Denver." "Wait," Jonas said. "I gave you what you wanted. You promised consideration." "I promised the prosecutor might consider it. I made no promises myself." Cheswick's voice was cold. "You poisoned hundreds of people. You destroyed families. You corrupted an entire supply chain. The fact that you're willing to confess doesn't change what you've done. Then why should I cooperate? Why shouldn't I just recant everything I said? Because we have your confession in front of 8 witnesses. Because we have Margaret Vale's evidence. Because whether you cooperate or not, you're finished." Cheswick leaned on the table. "The only question is whether you spend your final years in a federal prison or hanging from a rope. That's the choice I'm offering." Jonas looked around the room, searching for allies. He found none. Even his own guards had backed away, unwilling to be associated with him now that his crimes were public. Finally, his shoulders slumped. "Fine. Do what you want." Rowan tied Jonas's hands with rope from the storage room. The other investors began gathering their belongings, clearly eager to distance themselves from the scandal. Within an hour, half of them had left despite the late hour. Clara stood in the kitchen, suddenly exhausted. She'd been running on anger and determination for so long that now, with Jonas finally caught and confessing, she didn't know what to feel. Rowan found her there, leaning against the work table where she'd prepared hundreds of meals. "It's over," he said. "Is it?" Jonas confessed. "We have evidence. Cheswick is taking him to federal authorities tomorrow. This is what we wanted." Clara nodded slowly. "Yeah, this is what we wanted." But it didn't feel like victory. It felt hollow, like they'd climbed a mountain only to discover the view from the top was just more mountains stretching endlessly into the distance. "Your mother would be proud," Clara said quietly. Rowan's expression tightened. "Would she?" "We didn't find her killer. Jonas said he didn't do it, and I believe him, which means someone else is out there, someone who murdered an investigator and got away with it. Maybe, but we exposed the corruption she died trying to reveal. We made sure her evidence mattered. That counts for something." "I know. It's just—" Rowan stopped. Started again. "I've spent 20 years imagining what I'd do when I finally found the person responsible. And now that we're here, I realize finding them won't bring her back. Nothing will." Clara understood that feeling. She'd buried Thomas 6 months ago, and even with Jonas's confession, Thomas was still dead. Justice didn't resurrect the people you'd lost. It just made sure they weren't forgotten. "We should get some sleep," Clara said. "Tomorrow's going to be complicated." "Yeah." Rowan didn't move. "Thank you, by the way." "For what?" "For not giving up, for pushing when I wanted to quit, for being stubborn enough to see this through." "You hired me to cook." "I hired you because of a recipe, but you stayed because you wanted the truth. That's different." Clara almost smiled. "Yeah, I guess it is." They stood in the quiet kitchen, 2 people who'd been brought together by tragedy and circumstance, and a bowl of survival porridge that had tasted like justice, waiting to be served. The next morning, Cheswick left for Denver with Jonas in custody and 2 of the remaining investors as witnesses. He'd asked Rowan to come along, but Rowan had refused. He said he'd done his part. Now it was up to the legal system to finish what his mother had started. Clara wasn't sure she believed the legal system would actually deliver justice. She'd seen too much corruption to trust institutions that were supposed to protect people, but maybe it didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was that they'd tried, that they'd taken evidence buried for 20 years and dragged it into the light, that they'd forced powerful men to answer questions they'd been avoiding for decades. That afternoon, Clara stood on the lodge porch watching clouds gather over the mountains. Snow was coming. She could feel it in the air, that particular cold that meant winter wasn't far behind. Rowan joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You planning to stay?" he asked. Clara took one of the cups. "I don't know. The job was temporary." "It doesn't have to be." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this lodge needs a permanent cook. Someone who understands survival. Someone I can trust." Rowan stared out at the valley. "I'm saying I could use a partner who isn't afraid to fight when fighting matters." Clara considered that. 6 months ago, she'd been desperate and alone with nowhere to go. Now she had a job, a purpose, and something that felt almost like belonging. "I'll stay through winter," she said. "After that, we'll see." "Fair enough." They drank their coffee in comfortable silence while the first snowflakes began to fall. Somewhere in Denver, Jonas Pritchard was being processed by federal marshals. Somewhere in the mountains, Margaret Vale's evidence was finally being examined by people who had the power to act on it. Somewhere across Colorado territory, families who'd lost husbands and sons and fathers would finally learn the truth about what killed them. And here at Vale Lodge, 2 survivors stood together on a porch, watching winter arrive and knowing they'd done everything they could to make sure the dead weren't forgotten. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an honest one. And sometimes, Clara thought, that was enough. Winter came hard that year. Snow fell for 3 days straight, burying the mountain trails under drifts so deep that even Rowan couldn't navigate them safely. The lodge became an island, isolated, quiet, and strangely peaceful after the chaos of Jonas's arrest. Clara settled into a routine that felt almost normal. She cooked. She maintained the kitchen. She kept the fires burning while Rowan handled repairs and checked on the supplies they'd need to survive until spring. They didn't talk much about what had happened. There wasn't much left to say. Jonas was in federal custody. Cheswick had sent word that the investigation was proceeding. Newspapers across Colorado were running stories about the contamination scandal, though most focused on sensational headlines rather than the victims. Clara tried not to think about it too much. She'd done what she came here to do. Thomas's death had meaning now. Margaret Vale's sacrifice hadn't been for nothing. That should have been enough. But some nights, lying in her narrow bed listening to wind howl through the mountains, Clara felt an emptiness that had nothing to do with hunger or cold. She'd spent 6 months running toward revenge, and now that she'd found it, she didn't know what came next. One evening in late November, Rowan knocked on her door after dinner. "There's something I need to show you," he said. Clara followed him downstairs to his room. He'd spread papers across his desk, documents she recognized as copies of his mother's evidence. "I've been reading through these again," Rowan said, trying to understand the full scope of what she uncovered. "And I found something that doesn't make sense." "What?" He pointed to a shipping manifest dated February 1860. "This is a list of contaminated meat shipments. Jonas's company delivered them to mining camps across Wyoming and Colorado. But look at the signature approving the delivery." Clara leaned closer. The signature was barely legible, but she could make out enough letters to see it wasn't Jonas's name. "Who's R. Dalton?" she asked. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. The name appears on at least 20 different documents, always approving deliveries, always signing off on quality inspections that clearly never happened." "Could be a forged signature. Jonas said he bribed inspectors." "Maybe, but my mother circled this name in her notes, multiple times, like she thought it was important." Clara studied the manifest. "You think this Dalton person is the one who killed her?" "I don't know, but I think he's the connection we're missing. Jonas was just a contractor. He poisoned the meat, but someone had to be coordinating the cover-up, making sure complaints disappeared, ensuring investigations went nowhere." "And you think Dalton was that person?" "I think it's worth finding out." Clara felt something stir in her chest. Not quite hope, but close. "How do we find someone from 20 years ago? They could be dead. They could have moved to another territory. They could be using a different name. Or they could still be working for the railroad." Rowan pulled out another document. "This is a list of current executives at Northern Pacific. One of the names is Richard Dalton, Vice President of Operations." Clara's breath caught. "Same person?" "I don't know, but it's a hell of a coincidence." They stared at the papers in silence. Clara's mind raced through possibilities. If Dalton was still alive and working for the railroad, Then he'd spent 2 decades profiting from the same corruption that had killed Margaret Vale and Thomas Whitmore. He'd attended business meetings, collected his salary, lived a comfortable life while families buried their dead and never learned the truth. The injustice of it made Clara's throat tight. "What do we do?" she asked. "We gather more evidence. See if we can connect current operations to the old contamination schemes. If Dalton's still involved, there'll be patterns." "And if we find those patterns?" Rowan's expression hardened. "Then we make sure he answers for what he's done, just like Jonas." The next 3 weeks were consumed by research. Clara and Rowan pored over every document they could find: shipping records, financial statements, correspondence between railroad executives. They made lists, drew connections, built a timeline that stretched from 1860 to the present day. And slowly, a picture emerged. Richard Dalton had started as a junior inspector in 1859. Within a year, he'd been promoted to regional supervisor. By 1865, he was managing supply contracts for the entire Northern Pacific extension. By 1870, he was vice president of operations, one of the most powerful positions in the company. His rise had been meteoric, suspicious, and every major promotion coincided with a period of increased contamination incidents. "He's been doing this the entire time," Clara said one night, staring at their timeline. "Jonas was just one contractor. Dalton's been orchestrating the whole operation for decades." Rowan traced a line connecting various incidents. "Look at this. Every time a new territory opened up, contamination incidents spiked for 6 months. Then they'd drop off. Then spike again when the next territory developed." He was testing markets, seeing how much contamination people would tolerate before they started asking questions. And when they did ask questions, people like your mother disappeared. The words hung heavy between them. Clara thought about all the families who'd lost someone over the past 20 years. Miners who died from bad meat, railroad workers who got sick and couldn't work, children who grew up without fathers because a man in an office decided profit mattered more than human life. The scale of it was monstrous. "We need to go to Denver," Clara said. Rowan looked up. "Why?" "Because sitting here reading documents isn't enough. We need to confront Dalton, get him on record admitting what he's done. That's dangerous." "I don't care." "Clara, my husband is dead because of men like Dalton. Your mother is dead because she tried to stop them. How many more people have to die before we finish this?" Rowan studied her face. "You've changed since Teller Ridge." "Yeah, I have." "The woman who showed up at that competition just wanted to survive. Now you're talking about confronting a railroad executive who's been covering up murder for 20 years. Clara met his eyes. "Maybe survival isn't enough anymore. Maybe I'm tired of watching powerful men get away with killing people who don't matter to them. And if Dalton has us killed, then at least we'll die fighting instead of hiding." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, we go to Denver, but we do it smart. We bring copies of all the evidence. We make sure multiple people know where we're going and why. And we don't confront Dalton alone. Who else would come with us? I know a federal marshal named John Vickers. He's one of the few lawmen I actually trust. If we present him with evidence first, he can make the arrest official." "You think he'll believe us?" "He'll believe the documents. That's good enough." They left for Denver 3 days later, as soon as the weather cleared enough to make the mountain pass navigable. The journey took 4 days through snow and freezing wind that cut straight through Clara's coat. By the time they reached the city, her face was numb and her fingers wouldn't stop shaking. Denver had grown since Clara last saw it. New buildings crowded the streets, telegraph wires stretched overhead, horse-drawn carriages competed with freight wagons for space on roads that couldn't accommodate all the traffic. It smelled like coal smoke and human waste and ambition. Rowan led her to a boarding house on the edge of downtown. They got separate rooms and spent the evening organizing their evidence into a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss. The next morning, they met Marshal Vickers at his office near the federal courthouse. He was younger than Clara expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a way of standing that suggested he'd spent time as a soldier. He listened without interrupting while Rowan explained what they'd found. When they finished, Vickers leaned back in his chair. "This is a hell of an accusation." "It's documented," Rowan said, sliding the papers across his desk. "Everything we're saying is backed by evidence." Vickers read through the document slowly. His expression grew darker with each page. Finally, he looked up. If even half of this is true, we're talking about one of the biggest corruption scandals in territorial history. It's all true, Clara said. Jonas Pritchard already confessed to his part. Now we need Dalton to answer for his. Getting a confession from a contractor is one thing. Getting one from a railroad executive is something else entirely. These men have lawyers, powerful friends, political connections. Are you saying you won't help us? I'm saying we need to be careful. If we move too fast, Dalton will disappear. If we move too slow, he'll destroy evidence. Vickers tapped the papers. But if we do this right, we can bring down the entire network, not just Dalton, everyone involved. How long will that take? Rowan asked. Months, maybe longer. We'll need to coordinate with federal prosecutors, get subpoenas, build an ironclad case. Clara felt frustration rising in her chest. And in the meantime, Dalton keeps working, keeps profiting, keeps getting away with it. That's how the law works, Mrs. Whitmore. I know it's not satisfying, but cutting corners now means he walks free later. Is that what you want? No, it wasn't what Clara wanted. But she also didn't want to wait months while lawyers argued over technicalities and powerful men used their influence to muddy the truth. What if we could get him to confess? Clara asked. Like Jonas did. What if we confronted him directly? Vickers frowned. That's a bad idea. Why? Jonas confessed when faced with evidence. Maybe Dalton would too. Jonas confessed because he was surrounded by witnesses and had nowhere to run. Dalton is different. He's smarter, more careful, and he has the resources to make problems disappear. Vickers leaned forward. You confront him without proper legal protection, and you're just giving him a reason to come after you. Then come with us, Rowan said. Make it official. Bring deputies. Record everything he says. Vickers considered that. It's risky. Everything about this is risky. True. Vickers stood up and walked to the window. He stared out at the street for a long moment. All right, here's what we'll do. I'll arrange a meeting with Dalton under the pretense of discussing railroad security. You two will be there as witnesses. We'll present the evidence and see how he reacts. If he confesses, great. If not, we at least get his response on record. When? Clara asked. Tomorrow afternoon. That gives me time to set things up properly. After they left Vickers' office, Clara and Rowan walked through Denver's crowded streets without speaking. Clara's mind churned with anxiety and anticipation. Tomorrow they'd finally confront the man who'd orchestrated decades of corruption. The man who'd probably ordered Margaret Vale's death. Part of her wanted revenge. Wanted to see Dalton's face when he realized his crimes were finally catching up to him. But another part of her, the part that had spent 6 months learning to survive, just wanted it to be over. She wanted to go back to the lodge and cook meals and live a life that didn't revolve around dead husbands and buried evidence. You all right? Rowan asked. I don't know. We don't have to do this. We can let Vickers handle it through official channels. Clara stopped walking. Yes, we do. We're the ones who found the evidence. We're the ones who kept looking when everyone else gave up. We owe it to your mother and my husband to see this through. Rowan nodded. Yeah, we do. The next afternoon, they met Vickers at the Northern Pacific Railroad offices, a 3-story brick building in the heart of Denver's business district. 2 deputies accompanied them, both carrying rifles and looking uncomfortable with whatever they'd been told about this meeting. The receptionist led them upstairs to a conference room where Richard Dalton was already waiting. He was older than Clara expected. 60, maybe older, with silver hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. His face was weathered but composed, the face of someone who'd spent his life making difficult decisions and sleeping fine afterward. He stood when they entered. Marshal Vickers, I wasn't expecting such an official visit. Mr. Dalton, thank you for making time. Vickers gestured at Clara and Rowan. These are the witnesses I mentioned, Clara Whitmore and Rowan Vale. Dalton's expression didn't change, but Clara saw his eyes flicker with recognition when he heard Rowan's last name. Vale, Dalton repeated. Any relation to Margaret Vale? She was my mother. I see. I remember her. Bright woman. Tragic what happened. Was it? Rowan's voice was cold. Seemed pretty convenient to me. Dalton's composure slipped slightly. I'm not sure what you're implying. Let's sit down, Vickers said before Rowan could respond. We have some questions about supply chain operations. They arranged themselves around the conference table. Vickers placed the documents they'd brought in the center where everyone could see them. Mr. Dalton, can you explain your role in approving contaminated meat shipments between 1860 and 1880? Dalton barely glanced at the papers. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. I approved hundreds of shipments during that period. I can't possibly remember specific details from 20 years ago. These aren't just any shipments. These are ones that made people sick, some fatally. That's a serious accusation. It's a documented fact. Vickers spread out the manifests. Your signature appears on quality inspection reports for meat that was later proven to contain dangerous levels of arsenic and lead. Dalton picked up one of the manifests. He studied it carefully, his face revealing nothing. This signature could belong to anyone. Forgery was common in those days. Jonas Pritchard says you coordinated the entire contamination scheme. Jonas Pritchard is a criminal trying to reduce his sentence by implicating others. I wouldn't put much faith in his testimony. Claire had been sitting quietly, but now she spoke. Your signature is on the inspection report for the shipment that killed my husband, February 1883, Northern Pacific route through Wyoming. Dalton looked at her for the first time. Really looked. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitmore, but I sign hundreds of reports every month. I can't be held responsible for every unfortunate incident. It wasn't unfortunate, it was murder. That's a very serious charge. One that's backed by 20 years of evidence. Dalton set the manifest down carefully. Marshal Vickers, I appreciate your diligence, but unless you're here to arrest me, which I assume you're not, given the informal nature of this meeting, I don't see what purpose this serves. I've answered your questions. I've acknowledged my signature on documents that are 2 decades old. Beyond that, I have nothing to add. Vickers exchanged a glance with his deputies. We'd like to examine your current shipping records. Compare them to the historical patterns. Do you have a warrant? Not yet. Then I'm afraid I can't grant access to proprietary company documents. Dalton stood up. If you'd like to pursue this matter further, I suggest you speak with our legal counsel. They'll be happy to accommodate any official requests. He was leaving, just walking away like they hadn't spent months gathering evidence. Like Margaret Vale hadn't died trying to expose him. Like Thomas Whitmore and hundreds of other men hadn't been poisoned because of his greed. Clara stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. You killed them, she said. All of them. You approved shipments you knew were contaminated, you covered up complaints, you silenced investigators, and you did it for money. Dalton paused at the door. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you're grieving, but making unfounded accusations won't bring your husband back. They're not unfounded. We have proof. You have old documents and the testimony of a convicted criminal. That's not proof. That's desperation. Something inside Clara snapped. She'd spent 6 months being careful, being patient, following rules and procedures and trusting that the system would eventually deliver justice. But looking at Dalton's calm, indifferent face, the face of a man who'd destroyed countless lives and felt no remorse, Clara realized the system wasn't going to save them. You're right, she said quietly. I am desperate. I'm desperate to make sure no other widow stands where I'm standing. No other child grows up without a father because you decided profit was more important than human life. That's very touching, but it's also emotional manipulation, not evidence. Then let me give you evidence. Clara pulled out one more document, one she and Rowan had kept separate from the others. This is a letter dated March 1883, 1 month after my husband died. It's addressed to you from Jonas Pritchard. In it, he discusses adjusting the concentration levels to reduce visibility while maintaining market impact. What do you suppose that means? Dalton's face paled. I'll tell you what it means, Clara continued. It means you and Jonas were actively coordinating how much poison to put in the meat. Enough to make people sick, but not so much that anyone would notice the pattern. That's not negligence. That's premeditated murder. Where did you get that letter? Does it matter? You wrote it. Your name is on the reply. Your signature approving the new concentration levels. Dalton looked at Vickers. That document was obtained illegally. It's inadmissible. We'll let a judge decide that, Vickers said. He nodded to his deputies. Mr. Dalton, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and negligent homicide. You have the right to go. This is outrageous. I want my lawyer. You'll get one, right after we process you. The deputies moved forward. Dalton tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. Within seconds, they had him in handcuffs. He looked at Clara with pure hatred. You have no idea what you've done. The people I work with, the people who profit from these operations, they don't forget. Neither do I, Clara said. Vickers led Dalton out of the conference room. The deputies followed, leaving Clara and Rowan alone with the scattered documents. Clara's hands were shaking. She sat down hard, suddenly exhausted. We did it, Rowan said quietly. Did we? He'll have lawyers. He'll fight the charges. He might walk. Maybe. But we got him arrested. We got his confession on record. That's more than anyone's managed in 20 years. Clara wanted to feel victorious, wanted to feel the satisfaction of seeing a guilty man finally face consequences. But all she felt was tired. Rowan sat down beside her. My mother would have liked you. Yeah. Yeah, she always said the strongest people aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who get back up after falling and keep moving. Clara thought about the past 6 months. The grief, the desperation, the slow transformation from widow to survivor to something harder that didn't have a name yet. I don't feel strong, she admitted. You stood in front of a man who's been untouchable for decades and made him answer for his crimes. That's pretty damn strong. Maybe. Or maybe she'd just been too angry to quit. Either way, it was finished now. Thomas's death had meaning. Margaret Vale's sacrifice had led somewhere. The contamination scheme that had killed hundreds of people was finally exposed. That should have been enough. Spring came slowly to the mountains. The snow melted in uneven patches, revealing brown grass and frozen ground that would take weeks to thaw. Clara spent those weeks rebuilding her life in ways that had nothing to do with revenge or justice or buried evidence. She cooked. She taught survival skills to miners' families who'd lost their primary earners. She opened the lodge's second kitchen, a smaller space where anyone could come for a meal regardless of whether they could pay. Word spread. Within a month, people were traveling from camps across the valley just to learn Margaret Vale's recipes. The meals that kept people alive when there was nothing else. The techniques that turned desperation into survival. Clara taught them all. Some days, standing in that kitchen, surrounded by women and children and men who'd lost everything, Clara felt something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Purpose. Not the burning, angry purpose that had driven her to Denver. Something quieter. Something sustainable. The newspapers eventually picked up the story. Trials began. Jonas Pritchard pleaded guilty and received 15 years in federal prison. Richard Dalton fought the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. His trial lasted 3 months and ended with a conviction. 25 years for conspiracy, fraud, and multiple counts of negligent homicide. The railroad company paid compensation to families who could prove their losses were connected to contaminated shipments. It wasn't much. Money never was when measured against a human life, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that the deaths mattered, that the victims mattered. Clara received a settlement for Thomas's death. She used it to expand the lodge's community kitchen and establish a fund for widows who needed help getting through their first winter alone. She called it the Margaret Vale Memorial Fund. Rowan helped with everything. Somewhere between confronting Dalton and watching spring return to the mountains, he'd stopped being just her employer. He'd become her partner in building something that actually helped people instead of destroying them. One evening in late April, they sat on the lodge porch watching the sun set over the valley. The air smelled like pine and snowmelt and possibility. You ever think about leaving? Rowan asked. Clara considered the question. Sometimes, but then I remember I spent 6 months running. I'm tired of running. So you're staying? Yeah, I'm staying. Rowan nodded slowly. Good, because I don't think I could do this without you. Do what? Whatever comes next, building something good out of all the bad. Clara understood that. They'd both spent years carrying grief that had hardened into anger. But somewhere along the way, that anger had transformed into something more useful, something that actually helped people instead of just hurting the ones who deserved it. Your mother would be proud of what you've built here, Clara said. What we've built, Rowan corrected. Yeah, what we've built. The sun dropped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Clara why she'd come west in the first place. Not for revenge, not for justice, for a second chance, for the possibility that loss didn't have to define everything that came after. She thought about Thomas sometimes, about the life they'd planned that never happened, about the future they'd lost when he died from poisoned meat in a territory that didn't care about people like them. But she also thought about the families she'd fed this winter, the children who'd learned to cook survival meals that might save their lives someday, the widows who'd found community in a kitchen that used to serve only wealthy men. Thomas would have liked that. He would have liked knowing his death led somewhere, that it meant something beyond grief and anger and empty revenge. The first stars appeared overhead. Clara counted them the way she'd counted days since Thomas died. But this time, the counting felt different. This time, it felt like measuring the distance she'd traveled instead of the distance she'd lost. Beside her, Rowan sat quietly. His own grief finally settled into something bearable. They didn't talk, didn't need to. They'd survived something terrible together and come out the other side changed, but not broken. That was enough. In the valley below, lights began appearing in cabin windows, families settling in for the night. People living lives that were hard and uncertain, but no longer poisoned by men who'd valued profit over humanity. Clara had come to these mountains with $43 and a recipe hidden inside an iron pot. She was leaving behind something worth more than any prize money, a place where survival meant more than just staying alive, a place where the dead were remembered, a place where widows became survivors, and survivors became something stronger, a place that finally felt like home. You said, Part 5, Louis, viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 5, Louis, viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương, sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Việt như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chỉ đan bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 1532. Claude responded. Part 5 to high. Part 5. They'd been back at the lodge for 2 weeks when the telegram arrived. Rowan rode down to the Valley post office to pick up supplies and returned with a yellow envelope that he handed to Clara without a word. She opened it, standing in the kitchen, flour still dusting her hands from the bread she'd been kneading. The message was brief. Dalton trial postponed indefinitely. New evidence submitted by defense. Vickers. Clara read it twice, then crumpled the paper in her fist. What's wrong? Rowan asked. They're delaying the trial. Dalton's lawyers found something. Rowan's expression darkened. What kind of something? Vickers didn't say, just that new evidence was submitted. Clara threw the telegram onto the work table. This is what happens. We do everything right. We gather proof. We get him arrested. And then lawyers find some technicality that lets him walk. He's not walking, not yet. But he might. And if he does, everything we did was for nothing. Rowan picked up the crumpled telegram and smoothed it out. We don't know what the new evidence is. Could be nothing. Could be his lawyers just buying time. Or it could be something that destroys our entire case. Then we go back to Denver. We talk to Vickers. We figure out what we're dealing with. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to say she was tired of fighting battles that never seemed to end. But the look on Rowan's face, that quiet determination that had carried him through 20 years of searching for answers, reminded her that some fights didn't end just because you were exhausted. They left the next morning. Marshal Vickers met them at his office, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Papers covered every surface of his desk. His eyes were bloodshot and his collar was unbuttoned, small signs that whatever he'd been dealing with wasn't good. "Thanks for coming," he said without preamble. "We've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" Rowan asked. Vickers pulled out a folder and opened it. Inside were documents Clara had never seen before: letters, financial records, testimony statements. Dalton's defense team submitted evidence suggesting the contamination wasn't intentional. They're arguing it was a systemic failure of preservation technology, that arsenic and lead were commonly used in the preservation process during that era, and the amounts found in the meat were within acceptable ranges for the time. Clara felt sick. That's a lie. Jonas confessed. He admitted they deliberately increased contamination levels. "I know, but Jonas's confession is being challenged. His lawyers are claiming he was coerced, that we pressured him into making false statements in exchange for a reduced sentence." "That's insane. We had 8 witnesses. We had 8 railroad investors who all benefited from the same contracts Jonas supplied. The defense is arguing they had motivation to throw him under the wagon to protect themselves." Rowan leaned forward. "What about Margaret Vale's evidence? The documents we found?" "That's where it gets complicated." Vickers pulled out another paper. "The defense is questioning the chain of custody. They're saying the documents could have been tampered with during the 20 years they were hidden, that there's no way to prove they're authentic." "My mother's handwriting can be forged, or so they'll argue." Vickers rubbed his face tiredly. "Look, I believe you. I believe every piece of evidence you brought me, but belief isn't enough in a courtroom. We need something concrete, something they can't dispute." Clara's mind raced. They'd spent months building this case. They'd found documents that had been buried for 2 decades. They'd gotten confessions from the men responsible. And now lawyers were tearing it all apart with procedural arguments and technical challenges. "There has to be something," Clara said. "Some piece of evidence they can't explain away. If there is, I haven't found it yet." Vickers gestured at the papers on his desk. "I've been going through everything we have, every document, every testimony, looking for something ironclad that proves intentional contamination." "The letter," Clara said suddenly. "The one I showed Dalton during the confrontation, where Jonas discusses adjusting concentration levels." Vickers nodded slowly. "That's our strongest piece. But the defense is claiming it's taken out of context, that concentration levels refers to preservation solution, not poison, that we're reading malicious intent into normal business communication." "That's ridiculous." "Maybe. But it's also plausible enough to create reasonable doubt." The room fell silent. Clara looked at Rowan, who stared at the floor with an expression that said he was running through possibilities and coming up empty. Finally, Clara spoke. "We need to find more victims. People who got sick from the contaminated meat and survived. If we can show a pattern across decades, dozens of cases, maybe hundreds, that's harder to dismiss as coincidence." Vickers considered that. "It's a good thought. But most of those people are scattered across territories. Some are probably dead by now. Others moved on. Tracking them down would take months." "So we take months. Dalton's trial is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. Even with the postponement, we don't have that kind of time." Clara felt frustration building in her chest. "Then what do we do? Just give up?" "I'm not giving up. I'm saying we need to be strategic. We need to focus our energy on evidence we can actually present." "What evidence? You just said everything we have can be disputed." "Not everything." Vickers pulled out a different folder. "There's one angle the defense hasn't addressed yet. Financial records. If we can show that Dalton personally profited from the contamination scheme, that his wealth increased in direct correlation with contamination incidents, that's evidence of motive." Rowan looked up. "Where would we find those records? Bank statements? Property purchases? Investment portfolios? The kind of financial documentation people don't usually hide because they don't think anyone will look for patterns. And you think Dalton was sloppy enough to leave a trail?" "I think he was arrogant enough to believe he'd never get caught. Men like him don't cover their tracks because they don't think they need to." Vickers closed the folder. "But accessing those records requires subpoenas, court orders, time we might not have." Clara stood up. "Then we don't go through official channels." Both men looked at her. "What are you suggesting?" Vickers asked carefully. "I'm suggesting we get the records ourselves." The same way we found Margaret Vale's evidence, by looking where no one else thinks to look. That's illegal. So is poisoning hundreds of people. Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate your determination, but I can't condone breaking the law. Anything you obtained illegally would be inadmissible in court. Unless we find something so damning that Dalton confesses rather than let it go public. Vickers and Rowan exchanged glances. That's a hell of a risk, Rowan said. It's the only move we have left. Rowan studied her face. You've really changed since Teller Ridge. Yeah. Turns out losing everything makes you less worried about following rules that were written to protect people who never needed protection. Vickers sighed. I can't officially support this, but I also can't stop you from conducting private research into publicly available information. Is Dalton's financial information publicly available? Clara asked. Some of it. Property records are public, business filings are public. What you do with that information, he shrugged, is between you and your conscience. Clara understood what he was offering. Plausible deniability. Permission without authorization. Where do we start? She asked. Over the next 4 days, Clara and Rowan became experts in financial investigation. They visited the county recorder's office and copied property records. They examined business filings at the Territorial Commerce Office. They tracked down old newspapers that reported on Dalton's various investments and business ventures. And slowly, a picture emerged. Richard Dalton had been a junior railroad inspector in 1859, earning a modest salary. By 1865, he owned 3 properties in Denver. By 1870, he'd invested in mining operations, timber companies, and freight services. By 1880, he was one of the wealthiest men in Colorado Territory. His wealth had grown exponentially, suspiciously, and every major financial leap corresponded with periods of increased contamination incidents. Clara plotted it all on a timeline they'd spread across their boarding house room floor. Property purchases after the 1862 Wyoming contamination outbreak. Mining investments following the 1867 Colorado incidents. Freight company acquisitions in 1874, right when Northern Pacific was dealing with its worst string of worker deaths. The correlation was undeniable. He made a fortune off dead workers, Clara said quietly. Every time people died, his wealth increased. Rowan crouched beside the timeline. How did no one notice this? Because no one was looking. People see what they expect to see. A successful railroad executive investing his salary. No one thinks to check whether the salary alone could have generated this kind of wealth. So how do we prove the money came from the contamination scheme? That was the problem. They had correlation, but not causation. They could show that Dalton got rich while people died, but they couldn't prove the two were connected, unless they found direct evidence of payment. We need to see his bank records, Claire said, the actual deposits. If Jonas or other contractors were paying him directly, there'll be a trail. Banks don't just hand over records to random people asking questions. No, but they keep records in vaults that might not be as secure as they think. Rowan straightened up. You're talking about breaking into a bank. I'm talking about looking at records that should be public but aren't because powerful men have decided their privacy matters more than justice. Clara, my husband died because men like Dalton valued money over human life. Your mother died trying to expose that. How many more people need to suffer before we stop playing by rules that only protect the guilty? Rowan was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was measured. If we do this and get caught, everything we've built falls apart. The trial, the evidence, all of it becomes tainted by our criminal actions. And if we don't do it, Dalton walks free and the system proves once again that powerful men don't answer for their crimes. There has to be another way. There isn't. We've exhausted every legal option. This is what's left. Rowan looked at the timeline spread across the floor, at the evidence of corruption that spanned 2 decades, at the names of men who died while Richard Dalton got wealthy. All right, he said finally, but we do it smart. We plan every detail, and if it looks like we're going to get caught, we abort immediately. Clara nodded. Agreed. They spent the next week planning. Rowan called in a favor from someone who'd once worked as a bank clerk, a man who owed him for guiding his family through a bad winter. The man drew them diagrams of the bank's interior layout, explained how the vault system worked, described the night watchman's routine. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only one they had. On a moonless night in early March, Clara and Rowan approached the First National Bank of Denver through an alley that smelled like garbage and horse manure. They wore dark clothes and moved quietly, avoiding the gas lamps that lit the main streets. The back entrance was locked, but Rowan had brought tools. He worked the lock while Clara kept watch, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The lock clicked. They slipped inside. The bank's interior was dark, except for faint light from street lamps filtering through front windows. Clara could make out shapes, desks, chairs, the massive vault door at the back of the main room. Rowan moved toward the vault. According to their information, it would be locked, but not impossible to open if you knew what you were doing. The question was whether Rowan actually knew what he was doing, or if they were about to get caught attempting something far beyond their capabilities. He knelt in front of the vault and examined the locking mechanism. Clara stood behind him, every sense heightened by fear and adrenaline. She could hear sounds from the street, footsteps, voices, a horse whinnying somewhere nearby. "How long?" she whispered. "However long it takes. Stay alert." Minutes passed like hours. Clara's legs started to cramp from standing so still. She kept waiting for someone to walk through the door, for the night watchman to make his rounds, for a police officer to notice something wrong. Then she heard it. Footsteps outside the bank, coming closer. "Rowan," she hissed. "Almost there. Someone's coming." "I know." The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. Clara saw a shadow through the window, someone standing there, maybe looking at the lock, maybe just pausing. The vault clicked. Rowan pulled the heavy door open as quietly as possible. The shadow outside moved away. Footsteps receded. Clara exhaled. Inside the vault were filing cabinets filled with deposit records, loan documents, and account ledgers. Rowan pulled out the drawer labeled DF and began searching through folders. He found Dalton's records in the middle of the drawer, a thick folder containing years of banking history. They couldn't take the entire folder, that would be noticed immediately, but they could copy key pages. Clara had brought paper and pencils. She worked quickly, transcribing deposit amounts and dates while Rowan held up each page to catch what little light came through the windows. Some deposits were small, normal, the kind you'd expect from a railroad salary. But others were massive: $10,000 in June 1867, $15,000 in August 1874, $25,000 in March 1879. Each large deposit came exactly 2 weeks after a major contamination incident. Clara's hands shook as she wrote down the figures. This was it. This was the proof they needed. Direct evidence that Dalton had received massive payments following deaths that drove up demand for his contracts. They worked for 30 minutes, copying everything relevant. Then Rowan carefully returned the folder to its exact position and closed the vault. They left the way they'd come, locking the back door behind them. By the time they reached their boarding house, dawn was breaking over Denver's rooftops. Clara spread the copied records across their room's table and stared at them with something between triumph and exhaustion. "We did it," she said. "We committed multiple felonies. We got evidence that proves Dalton profited directly from contamination deaths. Evidence we obtained illegally. Evidence that shows a pattern so clear even his lawyers can't explain it away." Clara pointed at the deposit dates. "Look at this. Every single large deposit follows a contamination outbreak by exactly 2 weeks. That's not coincidence. That's payment for services rendered." Rowan studied the numbers. "It's damning. It's enough to make him confess, or enough to get us arrested for breaking into a bank." Clara met his eyes. "Was it worth it?" Rowan considered that question carefully. Then he nodded. "Yeah, it was worth it." They brought the copied records to Marshal Vickers the next morning. He looked at them without touching the papers, his expression caught between appreciation and concern. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "Does it matter?" Claire replied. "It matters if I'm going to use them. You can't use them. Not officially, but you can let Dalton know they exist. You can tell him we have proof of his financial motive, and you can give him a choice: confess voluntarily and face reduced charges, or go to trial knowing we'll find a way to make this information public." Vickers rubbed his jaw. "That's blackmail. That's justice." "It's both." Vickers picked up one of the pages and examined it. "If I do this, if I approach Dalton with illegally obtained evidence, I'm risking my career. My reputation, possibly my freedom. I know, Claire said, and I wouldn't ask if there was any other way, but we're out of options. This is what's left. Vickers was quiet for a long time. Then he set the paper down and looked at Clara and Rowan, with an expression that said he'd already made his decision and was just working through the implications. You two have more guts than sense, he said finally, but you're also right. This is the only move we have left. He gathered the papers. I'll approach Dalton's lawyers, show them what we have, see if they're willing to negotiate a confession in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. And if they refuse, then we leak it to the newspapers and let public opinion destroy him even if the legal system won't. Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but possibility. The first real possibility they'd had that this might actually end the way it needed to. 3 days later, Richard Dalton confessed. Not publicly, not in some dramatic courtroom moment, but in a closed meeting with his lawyers, the prosecutor, and Marshal Vickers, where he admitted to coordinating the contamination scheme, accepting payments from contractors like Jonas Pritchard, and covering up evidence of wrongdoing for over 20 years. In exchange for his confession, the prosecutor agreed to recommend 30 years instead of life in prison. Dalton would be eligible for parole after 20 if he cooperated fully with the investigation into other railroad executives who'd been involved. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. When Vickers brought the news to Clara and Rowan, they were sitting in a Denver coffee shop trying to figure out what came next. He confessed, Vickers said without preamble. Full admission of guilt, names of other people involved, everything. Clara set down her coffee cup slowly. Just like that? Just like that. Turns out seeing proof of your financial crimes laid out in chronological order is pretty motivating. What about us? Rowan asked. The bank records? What bank records? Vickers' expression was carefully neutral. As far as anyone knows, Dalton confessed because his conscience finally caught up with him. No one needs to know about how certain financial patterns came to light. Clara understood. Vickers was protecting them, making sure their illegal actions never became part of the official record. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. Dalton's confession opens up a whole investigation into railroad corruption. There'll be hearings, testimony, more trials. This isn't over. But Dalton will face consequences. He will. And so will the others once we track them down. Rowan leaned back in his chair. My mother spent years building a case against these people. She died before she could finish it. And now, he stopped, started again. Now it's actually happening. They're actually being held accountable. She'd be proud of you, Vickers said. Both of you. After Vickers left, Clara and Rowan sat in silence while the coffee shop bustled around them. People ordered drinks, discussed business, complained about weather and prices, and all the mundane frustrations of ordinary life. Clara envied them. She'd spent 6 months living inside a tragedy that had consumed every moment. Now that it was finally ending, she didn't know how to be normal again. What do we do now? She asked. Rowan thought about it. We go home, back to the lodge, back to living. Just like that? Just like that. It feels wrong somehow, like there should be more, like we should feel something bigger than just tired. Maybe that's what justice actually feels like, not triumph, just exhaustion and the knowledge that you did what you could. Clara considered that. She thought about Thomas, about how he'd died confused and in pain, never knowing why, about how she'd spent months trying to give his death meaning through revenge. But sitting here in this coffee shop, having finally exposed the men responsible, Clara realized revenge hadn't been what she was really looking for. She'd been looking for permission to move forward, permission to stop being defined by what she'd lost, permission to survive instead of just existing. Yeah, she said softly, let's go home. They left Denver the next morning. The journey back to the lodge felt different this time, lighter somehow, like they'd left behind weight they'd been carrying without realizing it. Spring was pushing hard against winter in the mountains. Snow still covered the high peaks, but down in the valleys, green things were starting to emerge. The air smelled like wet earth and possibility. When they reached the lodge, Clara found everything exactly as they'd left it. The kitchen was clean. The supplies were organized. The whole building waited patiently for them to return and fill it with purpose again. That night, Clara made dinner for just the two of them. Nothing fancy. Just simple food that tasted like survival and safety, and the beginning of something that might eventually become peace. They ate without talking much. There wasn't much left to say. They'd fought a battle that had lasted decades. They'd exposed corruption that had killed hundreds of people. They'd made sure the dead weren't forgotten and the guilty didn't walk free. That was enough. After dinner, Rowan helped Clara clean up. They worked side by side in the kitchen that had become something more than just a room for cooking. It had become the heart of everything they were trying to build, a place where survival meant more than staying alive. "I've been thinking," Rowan said while drying dishes, "about expanding the community kitchen, making it permanent, opening it to anyone who needs a meal regardless of season." Clara rinsed a pot. "That would take resources." "We have resources. The lodge does well enough. And after the compensation settlements, there's money set aside for victims' families. We could apply for funding." "You'd really want to do that? Turn this place into something beyond just a hunting lodge?" "This place stopped being just a hunting lodge the moment you walked in with that recipe. Now it's something more. Might as well lean into it." Clara smiled. It was the first real smile she'd felt in months. "Yeah, let's do it." Over the following weeks, they made it happen. They expanded the second kitchen, put out word across the mining camps and railroad towns that Vale Lodge offered free meals and cooking lessons every Tuesday and Thursday. They partnered with local merchants who donated supplies. They trained volunteers who wanted to help. People came. Miners' widows who'd lost husbands to contaminated meat and were struggling to feed their children. Railroad workers who'd been injured and couldn't work anymore. Families who'd fallen on hard times and needed help getting through until things improved. Clara taught them all. Not just cooking, surviving, how to make food last when there wasn't enough, how to forage safely, how to preserve and prepare and turn desperation into meals that kept people alive. She taught them Margaret Vale's recipes, the ones that had survived 20 years of silence and snow, the ones that had sparked a revolution against men who thought workers' lives were disposable. And every person who learned those recipes carried them forward, taught them to others, made sure the knowledge didn't die with the woman who'd given her life trying to expose the truth. By summer, word had spread far enough that newspapers were running stories about the lodge. Not about the corruption scandal, that was old news by then, but about what came after, about how two survivors had taken tragedy and transformed it into something that actually helped people instead of destroying them. One afternoon in July, a young woman appeared at the lodge carrying a battered suitcase and a baby on her hip. She looked exhausted, desperate, the same way Clara had looked 6 months earlier at Teller Ridge. "I heard you feed people here," the woman said. "I heard you teach survival cooking." "We do," Clara replied. "Come inside." The woman followed her into the kitchen. She set down her suitcase but kept holding the baby like she was afraid someone might take him. "My husband died last winter," she said. "Same fever that took a lot of men working the Northern Pacific routes. I've been trying to make it on my own, but—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to survive this." Clara understood that feeling completely. She'd been exactly there. Standing on the edge of giving up because the world was too hard and too cruel and too indifferent to whether she lived or died. "You're going to be all right," Clara said. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you're going to survive this. And more than that, you're going to help other people survive it too." "How?" "By learning, by staying, by refusing to let the men who caused this destroy you the way they destroyed your husband." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so tired." "I know, but you don't have to be strong right now. You just have to be here. The rest comes later." Clara fed her, gave her a room, taught her the first recipe, the same survival porridge that had started everything back at Teller Ridge. And when the woman eventually left the lodge 3 weeks later, she took with her more than just cooking knowledge. She took proof that grief didn't have to be the end of the story, that there was life after loss, even if it looked different than what you'd planned. That became Clara's purpose. Not revenge, not justice. Just helping people survive long enough to discover they were capable of more than just surviving. Rowan found his own version of peace. He continued guiding hunting expeditions, but he changed who he worked for. Instead of wealthy railroad investors, he started taking on clients who actually needed the wilderness. People trying to heal from trauma, families looking to reconnect, Men who'd lost themselves in cities and needed reminding that there was still wild, untamed country where a person could breathe. He also spent time teaching tracking and survival skills to young men from mining camps. Skills that might save their lives if they ever found themselves alone in the mountains with no supplies and a storm coming. One evening in late August, Clara and Rowan sat on the lodge porch watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and red that looked almost too beautiful to be real. "You think we made a difference?" Clara asked. Rowan considered the question carefully. "I think we tried, and I think trying matters more than succeeding." "That's not very satisfying." "No, but it's honest." Clara thought about everything that had happened since Teller Ridge, the evidence they'd found, the confrontations they'd survived, the justice they'd fought for. And she thought about the things that couldn't be measured in convictions and trials, the families they'd fed, the skills they'd taught, the woman who'd shown up desperate and left with hope. Maybe Rowan was right. Maybe trying was enough. "Your mother would be proud," Clara said, "not just because we exposed the corruption, but because of what we built after." Rowan nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think she would." They sat in comfortable silence while darkness crept across the valley. Stars emerged one by one. The same stars Clara had counted that first night at Teller Ridge, when she'd been alone and desperate and convinced she had nothing left to lose. She'd lost a lot since then. But she'd also found things she didn't know she needed: purpose beyond survival, community beyond loneliness, a partner who understood that healing didn't mean forgetting, but choosing to build something good from the ruins of something terrible. "I'm glad I came to that competition," Clara said quietly. "Even though you lost?" "I didn't lose. I found something more valuable than prize money." "What's that?" Clara thought about it. A reason to keep going that wasn't just about staying alive, a place where the dead are remembered, and the living have a chance to become something more than victims. Rowan looked at her with an expression that said he understood exactly what she meant. "That's what my mother wanted, not revenge, just remembrance in a world that was slightly better than the one she left." "Then that's what we'll keep building." They stayed on the porch until the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, and it became clear that another storm was rolling in from the high country. But this time, Clara wasn't worried. She'd survived worse storms than this. And she'd learned that survival wasn't about being strong enough to face everything alone. It was about being smart enough to know when you needed help and brave enough to accept it. The lodge would stand through this storm the same way it had stood through countless others. Solid. Permanent. A refuge for people who needed reminding that winter eventually gave way to spring and grief eventually transformed into something bearable. Clara had come to these mountains carrying $43 and a recipe she'd inherited from a dead woman who tried to change the world. She was leaving behind more than that. Not just recipes and survival skills, but proof that ordinary people could stand against corruption when institutions failed them. That widows weren't just victims to be pitied, but fighters capable of bringing down empires built on lies. That the dead deserved to be remembered not just for how they died, but for how their deaths inspired others to live differently. Inside the lodge, the fires were burning. The kitchen was stocked. Beds were made for people who would arrive tomorrow or next week, looking for help surviving impossible circumstances. Clara had survived. And in surviving, she'd discovered that the strongest thing a person could do wasn't winning fights, or destroying enemies, or proving they were tougher than the world that tried to break them. The strongest thing was choosing to help others survive too. Passing forward the knowledge and resources and hope that had kept you alive when everything else said you should have given up. That was Margaret Vale's legacy. Not the evidence she'd gathered or the corruption she'd exposed, but the recipe she'd left behind. A recipe that had traveled through families and territories and decades, keeping people alive when survival seemed impossible. And now Clara was adding to that legacy. Every person she taught, every meal she served, every young widow who arrived desperate and left with skills that would carry her through the hardest seasons of her life. Rowan stood up and stretched. "We should get inside before the storm hits." "Yeah, we should." But Clara stayed a moment longer, looking out at mountains she'd once thought would be her refuge and had instead become her home. Not because they were safe, mountains were never safe, but because they were honest. They didn't pretend to be easy. They didn't offer false comfort. They just stood there year after year, teaching anyone who paid attention that survival required more than luck or strength. It required patience, intelligence, community, the willingness to help others even when you were barely holding together yourself. Clara had learned those lessons, and now she was teaching them to anyone who needed to hear that they were capable of more than just surviving tragedy. They were capable of transforming it into something that actually mattered. The first drops of rain began to fall. Clara turned and walked back inside where warmth and light and purpose waited. She closed the door behind her, sealing out the storm but not the memory of everything she'd survived to reach this moment. Thomas was dead. Margaret Vale was dead. Hundreds of workers were dead because men had valued profit over human life. But their deaths had led somewhere. To justice for some. To accountability for others. And most importantly, to a place where survivors gathered to make sure the next generation wouldn't have to face the same impossible choices. That wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough to balance the scales or bring back what had been lost. But it was something. And in a world that often offered nothing to people like Clara, people who started with nothing and lost even that, something was everything. She walked into the kitchen where Rowan was already stoking the fire for tomorrow's cooking. They'd feed 20 people in the morning, teach survival skills in the afternoon, send them back into the world carrying knowledge that might save their lives or someone else's. And they'd do it again the next day, and the day after that. For as long as people needed help and Clara had the strength to provide it. That was survival. Not escaping danger, but choosing to face it again and again, because the alternative was letting the ones who'd hurt you define the rest of your life. Clara Whitmore had started her journey to these mountains as a widow with nothing left to lose. She'd become something more. Not a hero. Heroes lived in stories. Not in kitchen where the work was hard and constant and mostly thankless. But a survivor who'd learned that the strongest revenge wasn't destroying your enemies. It was living well enough that their cruelty couldn't destroy you. Building something good from the ruins they'd left behind. Making sure their victims were remembered not as casualties, but as people whose deaths meant something because of what came after. The storm broke overhead. Thunder rattled the lodge's windows. Rain hammered the roof. Inside, the fires kept burning. The kitchen stayed warm. And two people who'd survived impossible things worked side by side, preparing for tomorrow when more survivors would arrive looking for the same thing Clara had found here. Not an ending to their grief. Not revenge against the ones who'd wronged them. Just a place to rest. To learn. To remember that they were more than their losses. To survive.